What's up, comrades? Welcome to a very special episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're flipping the script on you this week. Instead of talking about a text, we decided to release an episode on a film. A very divisive, controversial, potentially dangerous film at that. Our normal crew for the patron-only episodes, myself, Comrade Adam, along with Comrades Don and Alex, thought the film was interesting enough and warranted a discussion that would be made accessible to all, be given freely to the people. Now, we initially talked about this being a patron-only episode, but after we actually did the discussion, talked about our various points and interpretations, we thought that it was important to share it with everybody for a couple of reasons. One, to counteract the monstrosity of the hot take industry rearing its ugly head to destroy the Joker, and also to give you an idea of what our patron-only episodes sound like in full. So we're just going to cut right to the chase. We're going to get into the discussion. It's a bit long, but we felt that the points we took to be most interesting and worthy of talking about in this film were quite many. So we really hope you enjoy this episode. We hope it adds some depth, some layers to your own interpretation if you've seen the film, or at the very least, if you've been reading some of the hot takes, it might expand your own thinking on whether or not you think the film is worthy of your time and attention. We certainly think it is, for numerous reasons which we will discuss at length in this episode. We're going to be back next week with our regularly scheduled programming. We're going to have a two-parter coming via a fan request. So if talking Joker is not your thing, just wait a while. We'll be back to our normal show, and you'll get what you want. All right, y'all, without further ado, here is our icy cold take on Joker. Enjoy, and we'll see you back here next week for our regularly scheduled programming on Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Peace. What's up, comrades? Welcome to Red Library. This is a special episode.
Explain.
How is it fucking special?
I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's just going to have the illusion of being special, but it's just your normally, regularly scheduled programming, I guess.
Hey, anytime that I'm with you two motherfuckers, it's a special podcast.
Damn, that's legit.
Yeah,
That's
just
legit.
wanted you to
Right
know
in the
that.
feels.
Right in the fields.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was aiming for.
We had talked about this maybe being a patron-only episode, but we decided we need to release it to the masses, to radicalize people, to, I don't know, what else would be the function? Mainly because it just works with our release schedule.
Yeah.
That's really the only
The
reason.
materialistic reason. Too.
Yeah, very materialistic.
I was going to
reason,
say
yeah.
it's for all the fucking great jokes we're going to have because, it's like a Joker podcast. So we're going to do a lot of stand-up jokes, right?
That's really all it is. It's just horrible stand-up for 2 hours.
Terrible stand-up. And we all just laugh maniacally the whole time.
I guess we sort of let the cat out of the bag. We're here to talk about hashtag society movie, otherwise known as Joker. All right.
Just fucking let's talk about this damn movie. Fucking ridiculous hype over this movie that actually was like not bad. I don't know. I liked it.
Are we getting into that already?
I don't know. What did you guys think? Like, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
Well, we saw it, a few days ago?
Yesterday.
Together now. Was it yesterday?
No, it was 2 days.
It was 2 days ago.
I mean,
Did you
was
watch
like-
it yesterday?
Yeah.
Did you go
son
watch
of
it
a
again?
bitch! You watched it
Oh,
again.
no, I forgot that originally we meant to talk about it yesterday.
But it
We had
didn't
seen it
happen.
the day before.
Yeah,
So I
that's
was
true.
thinking, yeah, it has been less than 2 days.
No, I watched it yesterday again with the.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Did you guys watch it again?
I was thinking about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
didn't get a chance to.
we watched it together, and then I watched like 17 YouTube videos about all the like Easter eggs and shit, and like caught none of them. So I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. Well, I guess I got to watch it again, and like the night off. So we watched it again.
Well-
Don't dox me.
Well, I guess speaking of like Easter eggs and all,
When you do this, can you beep out? Beep? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
I
let's do
beeped
that.
out Comrade Courtney's last name on the Conquest of Bread episode. So I can
okay.
definitely
Did she say her last name?
I think Jordan
Jordan,
did, and
yeah.
so
Ah,
I
okay.
beeped it out for her. So we can definitely do that.
Cool. Yeah. Let's
Yeah.
do it. Just beep out everybody's name
I'll
all
just
the time.
redact everything that I don't approve of you saying.
I just want you to go back and all the times that Comrade Commissar Don has said, just insert a beep.
We can, and then we'll re-release like 30-something episodes.
Just like delete the whole channel and then and then the only thing that's changed is the beeps.
Yeah,
for Comrade
we can do
Commissar
that.
Don.
Well, actually, maybe once we get enough patrons where we could actually pay someone to do this sort of
do
thing, we'll
editing.
just give them completely bullshit like busybody work. Like go back and beep out everyone's name who's ever been on any episode. I guess why I also think this is a special episode and not a patron-only episode, because we've mostly focused on movies and then we also did Ben Shapiro. But to me, I thought since we were going to talk about a film that might be a good patron-only episode, but I think that this film warrants a full release episode. For a number of reasons. I think the impact and like the sort of intense reactions it's provoked and its relationship to Marxist materialist-based politics and all sorts of different ways we understand political engagement in the social realm and how we understand that and like what we think that means. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this film. It's a dense film. There's so much going on in every frame. Yeah, and I mean, I guess the reactions to the film, the reactions themselves almost say a lot about our society. So I think those are sort of interesting to talk about in relation to actually what is in the film versus the reactions to it and the hot takes. We're not going to engage with a ton of those, but I'm hoping we'll provide some good old Red Library icy cold motherfucking takes on it in response.
Yeah. You guys want to like go around the table and talk about our like just initial reactions and maybe anything, general impressions?
Yeah, that sounds good. Sure. Yeah. Oh, also, let's just say this. I mean, we're going to spoil the fuck out of this movie. If you haven't seen it, just so you know, everything is going to be spoiled at some point. So just heads up.
Who wants to start?
I don't know. I guess you do since you spoke first.
Okay. I went into this movie very much not wanting to like it, but I don't know. I think it won me over. So I think it was much better than it had any like right to be. I
very
thought
much
that
agree.
There's like a lot of technical aspects of the film I thought were like quite good. The score and the sound design I thought was really good for it. And I think some of the cinematography stood out to me as well. But no, it was much better than expected.
Hell yeah. You want to go next or me?
I'll go. I mean, I actually had pretty high expectations for this film. After reading some of the initial hot takes and reading more than a fair share of responses basically saying, I'm not going to go see this film, and assumptions about it's a glorification of like white male mass murderers. So, I definitely had seen those. And in a lot of ways, I was actually really excited to see it because I had seen those commentaries about it, but also started to hear commentaries that it was very much like a class first, like social inequality first sort of film. And the idea that would come in the form of a Joker film to me was really fascinating. I mean, I think it actually exceeded my expectations. I think to me, there's a lot of levels to talk about this film on in terms of like its actual politics. I think the social reactions to it and whether people think that it's glorifying the Joker's character, which I think is actually a horrible reading of the film if that's what you take from it.
Definitely.
But also I think obviously in the realm of, let's say, like social work and psychology and psychoanalysis, the role of trauma, the way that I sort of texted you this earlier, to me, one of the most interesting things is like the Joker as a floating signifier, and then also the way that like projection and projective identification are operating, not only in the film, but the way that you experience the film as the spectator. So to me, I think outside of all the technical aspects you were talking about as well, Don, I mean, I think that's really complicated and definitely exceeds its own sort of conditions in a way that I didn't really expect. And I loved it.
Part of my, I guess, skepticism going into the movie was like how often are movies essentially like a big cultural conflict or something like that actually turn out to be really good movies. I feel like all the ones that generate, at least in the last couple of years, that have generated like a ton of controversy ended up being like pretty forgettable or pretty terrible movies.
What ones come to mind whenever you think of that?
I guess the first one I'd think of would be like Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. Man, how far that's just like fallen away down the memory hole already. I'm like, oh yeah, that was a whole nightmarish culture war scenario over that film. Yeah.
Man.
A lot of the, I guess, like cultural battle around the new Star Wars movies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Are there other ones I'm forgetting?
I mean, I think that we had discussed there are a lot of precedents for the sort of moral panic around certain films. I mean, things like Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, Natural Born Killers, that film being outlawed. There's a Jackman article that I read. I think they mentioned on the Chapo episode about this. Amber mentions it about like the Joker and a history of moral panics around films. That's, not like anything knock your socks off great, but it's just sort of like, yeah, there are these films that have these moments where it creates this sort of like moral panic around it and then looking at the actual effects of the film. So I think, it kind of falls into that category.
Yeah, I agree with all that stuff. I think a lot like Don, I was not expecting to like this movie going in. Like I kind of saw the hype about it, saw that it was Joaquin Phoenix and all of that. And I was like, this is going to be one of those like try hard movies that's basically at the end of the day, another fucking superhero movie. And
that we don't need at all.
That we don't need, and that I was like not interested in, especially after like in the DC franchise, after Christopher Nolan kind of fell off with, you know, that whole Dark Knight, whatever Batman trilogy he did. Like, I just was like, well, there goes all the hope that like the DC universe ever had for for a movie again, you know, like, but I have to say, like, it turned out to be quite the film. Like, I really like it. I mean, as a film, in seeing it with she was like, I think that could have been a standalone movie and didn't have anything to do with the DC universe. Like, she was like, they didn't mention any of the other superheroes. They didn't, like, other than saying Gotham and kind of invoking that sort of aesthetic of like Gotham City and the tensions that exist in Gotham. Like, there was almost no mention other than the fact that he's the Joker, and that's like very obvious throughout the movie. But like, just like kind of like you said as well, Don, like the technical aspects of the movie, it was cinematically beautiful. And like there were some shots, like I remember the shot after Fleck murders his mother in the hospital bed, and then there's like a scene where I think it's after that, where he's in the back of the bus, and he's just like sitting in the back of the bus, kind of looking off into the distance, and like there's like a slow kind of like dolly shot that like moves towards his face, and like I was like, this is beautiful. And like the scenes that were shot of like the cityscapes where they're like the kids are running around, some of the shots, so especially at the end where all the chaos is happening, where the scene where the Joker like gets to rise up,
he does in fact rise up.
They like lay him on the hood of the fucking police car, and then he like gets to like cough out blood, and then he gets up and it's like, ah! Well, like, so there's a scene where one of the like fucking clown thugs follows Thomas Wayne and his wife and the young Batman into an alley, and he ends up killing them. And there's just like this one little flash of a scene that was so fucking great because it looked exactly like a comic book panel. It
I
was
remember
like
when you're talking about
like Thomas and his wife and the kid like turn around the corner, and you can see them, and then it's like shot from above at an angle, and then you can just see the shadow of the fucking thug behind them against the wall on the corner. And so it's just, I don't know, just like fucking well done. And like the score, like you were saying, was like spot on. There's like That's Life, that kind of thematic song throughout the movie, like just everything fit together so well. Then Joaquin Phoenix with like the dance moves throughout the movie, kind of just like, it almost felt like, dare I say it felt like kind of like in Birdman, where they had the like freestyle drumming going on, the like free jazz, weird drumming happening throughout the movie, where it was like this thing that was punctuating the movie throughout and kind of showed the progression and like the development of the Joker into the Joker. But yeah, initially, overall, like I don't know, I was impressed. I was not disappointed by the movie in any way. In fact, I was like, this is way better than most superhero movies that you could go see. So
yeah, I felt like this was just going to be another gritty superhero movie that has kind of been overplayed for the last like 5 years or something. And so
thank God they didn't give it to Zack Snyder.
Oh my God. So good. But some of the humor I thought they did a great job with the humor. Not only a couple of scenes being like really funny when he runs into the door,
the glass door,
and then also like after he kills that ex like coworker, and there's the short guy that can't open the lock, where it's like that humor not only was very effective, but it's also like was punctuated at exactly the moments of where like really serious and depressing shit happened. And so I felt like that was a great like reveal into like almost having the audience feel exactly like the Joker, where it's like specifically like the most like dark and depressing times is what actually produces like the humor.
Well, I think on that note, maybe as a way to get into the content, I know we had discussed this a little bit after the film, but I actually think that to me, what sets this film apart and in some ways makes it so much more, I think, satisfying and sophisticated than even like Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker, I think is really this sort of strange embodiment in how Joaquin Phoenix does Joker's laugh. And to me, I think that even with Heath Ledger's Joker, there's this idea of, again, like the Joker is this floating signifier, right? The Joker is this sort of empty kind of symbolic thing that we kind of fill in at different points whenever the films are made about what exactly is the Joker, what does that mean to us? Or like us as the audience, what does it sort of embody? Now, I told you, Alex, I was going to do this whole episode just doing Jungian readings of the Joker, and this is where... No, I'm not going to do that, because fuck Jung, he was a reactionary.
Reactionary piece of shit.
But I think that, the idea... A Jungian reading would say, oh, the Joker is this timeless archetype that symbolizes the same things, blah, 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 and so on and so on. But I think actually a more interesting reading of the Joker is that he actually changes quite thoroughly depending on the depiction. And so for Joaquin Phoenix, I think what sets it apart is how the laugh is not just this maniacal, chaotic sort of laughter. It always starts in moments of intense pain and sadness and alienation and a feeling of like powerlessness. And then it starts as that, and then it sort of shifts at different moments into this sort of like mania and this just complete break with reality. And so to me, like the laugh itself like perfectly embodies what this depiction of the Joker really is, which is this deeply sad and yet somehow deeply comedic thing all at the same time. So to me, as soon as I saw his first laugh, that really struck me where I'm like, we're watching something very interesting and very different. And also it's not clearly stated that that's what's happening. But to me, it was one of those really excellent moments where they don't necessarily explain that to you. But as you watch the movie and absorb how that laugh embodies what his character is and what the film means, it was a great example of like how to communicate a really complicated message with very little information, I think.
The laugh is really interesting because kind of like riffing off of what you're saying, Don, the initial appearance of the laugh absolutely has that like really painful and sort of like uncomfortable character. Like, it's almost like one of the very first scenes of the movie. I want to say like after he gets beat up by the kids and he's at the social worker's office, and like he basically is just laughing for like fucking like a whole minute or like a minute and a half or something, and you're just like as a spectator just like sitting there like fucking what is this, you know? He's just like laughing, but it looks like it hurts really bad. And then as the movie progresses, that laugh becomes less and less painful, and it seems more and more like an expression of how like he's actually enjoying or like reveling in his own madness, kind of like.
Yeah, it's like the further break from reality, the more the laugh loses that sort of painful sad element and just becomes just complete absorbed into the just break with reality that he's experienced. One
more thing I was going to say is just that like the progression that like happens throughout the movie, like also like you were saying, Don, I'm just stealing all your ideas. This is, but like the progression that happens throughout the movie is kind of that. It's almost like as though if you were to see it from the Joker's perspective throughout the whole movie, the movie absolutely would appear as a comedy. Like all those like moments of brutality were like sort of like the punchlines of all of his jokes, especially like at the end, you know, where he's like laughing in his own head about the joke when he's like in Arkham, and then he's like, oh, you wouldn't get it, you know, and it's just sort of like supposed to be that final just like haha, and then he murders that woman. And so it's sort of, it just all comes together as like, if you're looking from the perspective of the Joker himself or like Arthur Fleck's character, what you see is absolutely a comedy throughout the whole thing. But like from the perspective of like the spectator that we have, or like from the perspective of all the rest of the people in his world, none of it is funny, and he's just making himself into a literal clown. And that actually happens throughout the movie as well. Like he slowly more and more just like falls into the character of the clown. So
and I think it starts to go away towards the end through that same theme that you were talking about, Adam. But I think at the beginning of the movie he has like two laughs. One which is where he's like he knows he's supposed to laugh like along with everybody else. And then one where it's like involuntary, of where he can't really control it. And I think it's like two, at least to me, it was two pretty distinct laughs. It's also interesting, like when he's at the comedy club, and he's like taking notes on the stand-up comedian that's there and stuff, and he's laughing at the exact opposite moment everybody else is laughing. And it's like interesting to think of, he seems to want to be funny in making everybody else laugh, and yet at the same time he doesn't seem to almost find, I don't want to say like he doesn't understand humor, but he definitely doesn't understand humor in the same way that like everybody else seems to. And so he has this like desire to make people laugh, and yet at the same time his sense of humor is like completely distinct from the people around him.
I think what's really important about that too is in that comedy club scene, what I found most interesting is he is laughing at all the exact moments when everyone else is not laughing. And as you see, he takes notes in these like very like Seven-esque Kevin Spacey, you know, preemptive, like, you know, this person is going to become a psychopathic killer by the way that they keep these really strange like composition notebooks with pornography and just like dark squares just etched into the pages.
I gotta say, that made me laugh really hard when he was like on stage in the stand-up show at Pogo's, which Pogo is like the name of the clown that Wayne Gacy was, or what's his name, John Wayne Gacy.
Oh, really? I didn't
that
catch
was his clown name, Pogo.
Yeah.
And so like it's fucked up. But anyway,
Deep cut right there.
yeah, and so like that made me laugh when he like opens up the thing and there's just a picture of like a naked woman on the back of it. I was like, what is this fucking crazy ass?
Well,
anyway, sorry to cut you off.
I mean, I think there are like two interesting things at that particular point in the film, because at this point, I would say that Fleck's character is definitely much, I think it's the point of the film where as the viewer, you're definitely much more empathetic and identifying with him, or at least like understanding the sort of pain of being just this completely alienated and completely like excluded person from the social order of class relations, of, well, I guess we can talk about the racial and gender politics at some point, because those are really interesting. But I think what's so interesting about that comedy scene is whenever he's writing in the notebook, he makes some comment of like, sex jokes make people laugh, and it's almost
sex
as if
jokes always funny.
Sex jokes always funny, and it's interesting because he's trying to understand and mimic what it is that other people find funny, and there's this way that it's almost as if throughout the film, those moments in the notebook are him wrestling with trying to fit into the general norms of like human interaction, and the question then becomes, what exactly is it that allows him not to fit into it? Is it, some sort of like mental illness? Is it the fact that he was like horribly traumatized and it was just basically repressing whatever he would eventually become as the Joker? But to me, that's what's interesting, is there's this way that it's him doing his best to fit into the society that he finds himself in, like human relations, and just having no idea how to really do that, and sort of the pain and exclusion of him struggling with that through the first part of the film. And again, I think what to me is fascinating and why it's so interesting to watch like people react to the film is because it creates this really complicated experience, because you know that he eventually is going to become Joker and become a just completely deranged mass killer. And yet at the same time, you're struggling because you understand the conditions that create monsters such as him. You have some ability to empathize and identify with that. And I think it's really hard to watch it in an era whenever films are very simplistic and how they portray protagonists and protagonists and
protagonists.
Yeah, and antagonists. But to me, I think it's just, that's one of those like key scenes where you kind of see him struggling to figure out like, how do I find human interaction with other people? And I think he's trying to find that through this, I guess, striving to be a comedian of some kind.
Yeah, I was going to say something about, because you had brought up earlier when you were saying your intro part about how like the reactions to this movie are like very sort of projective and like very assumptive. You had said they were assumptive as well, Don. And like, I think that much more so than glorifying the mass white murderer, right? Like, I think that this movie is almost trying to, in a candid way, show somebody who is suffering in that way that they, in some sense, do have a point, or like do have some aspect of insight into society in a way that others don't. And like, I think that it's very easy to mistake that kind of acknowledgement or validation, because like something like an example for just to show like kind of what I'm trying to say is that like, personally, maybe I'm just a fucking psycho, but like personally, I think that the jokes that he came up with, or at least the ones that are kind of highlighted throughout the movie, are like kind of funny. Like if you were a self-deprecating one-liner type of comedian that went on stage and just like made fun of yourself like a Mitch Hedberg, like they're funny. I hope that my death makes more sense than my life, but like sense is like CENTS. Like that's fucking
We're
funny.
going to have to talk about that, because to me, that is the perfect distillation of the anti-capitalist politics of this film, is in that exact line in his notebook.
Okay, yeah. Well, and then there's the other one when he's on stage doing stand-up, and they kind of don't play it when he first gets on stage, but when he's on the Murray show or whatever, they show it again.
People told me I couldn't be a stand-up comedian.
Yeah, because I wasn't funny, and he's like, "But who's laughing now?" Or like, "No one's laughing now," or something like that. I thought that was fucking funny, and I feel
like that's like it's a joke I've heard before.
Yeah,
it's like I think it's like a classic joke about comedians. Like actually, so I think actually it's like if it's delivered well. Yeah, it could be like a good joke.
And so I kind of feel like there was a way in which they were playing that against. If you were to hear these jokes in the context of knowing somebody was funny and like being there to see them specifically, and you heard them say a joke like that, you'd laugh. Yeah, and like it was just the fact that he's so awkward and that he was like laughing and being really like uncomfortable on stage that you wouldn't want to laugh at something like that, and you wouldn't appreciate the humor. And I think in some sense they're trying to like give him as a character that little bit of like, he is actually funny, and he does have a point to say, like, I'm the guy you would walk over in the street and no one acknowledges me because there's like this way that we determine funny from not funny, and that it's subjective and all this stuff. Like, it's almost like I'm pushing back about they're not glorifying this, because in a sense they absolutely are glorifying it. They are saying like, look, pay attention to this guy's story. How can you empathize with this person? Like, look at the ways that he is sort of like has no part in his own destruction or descent into madness. But then at the very same time, they're being like, well, but it is actually his fault. He's murdering a bunch of people.
Well,
and he's horrible.
I mean, I do think this is what makes the film interesting. So I would distinguish that particular moment from saying, listen, this character who has been deeply excluded, deeply brutalized, and forgotten his entire life, has something insightful to tell us about this. I feel like it's hard to talk about this without saying the society we live in. But I will say, I want to come back to this because I think that all these like sort of like hyper ironic, cynical takes where it's just like, oh yeah, I went to see Joker the movie, now I get my sociology degree because I know we live in a society. To me is actually like a deep symptom of where we have actually accepted sort of aspects of capitalist realism, and this aspect that like anything that even does attempt to sort of offer any kind of criticism of like quote unquote society is in itself try hard. And I think it's actually like sort of a postmodern sort of cynical, ironic a way to react to this film personally, but I digress. So to me, I think that saying that Arthur Fleck has something important to say about society precisely because he is like the excluded, like the subaltern, is not the same thing as glorifying how he responds to that. And I think that's what is really challenging about this film is that, you know, there are moments whenever you can kind of see that he does make a decision to take that alienation, that exclusion, and to turn that into like a violent nihilistic response. And I think one of the most interesting things about the film is that, you know, in the background, there is some sort of mass uprising. And one of the takes that I had, you know, sent y'all that it sort of mentions this and says, well, like Joker becomes this figurehead of this like populist, almost anarchist uprising. It's like, but the whole interesting thing about the movie is like, he's not though. It's like they pick him as a symbol, but his character is completely nihilistic about it and says, I believe in nothing. And it's just a way that he glorifies his own need to be seen and to be validated by society, that he accepts that position and sort of revels in it. But at no point do I think it's actually like glorifying him. I think it's actually saying there are different possibilities of how to respond to these types of social exclusion in the way that sort of like social norms do, and in effect like create aspects of judgment or like conditions of judgment of like, this is what's funny, this is what's not, this is who's included, this is who is excluded. And I think that what it's doing is just saying like, yes, and one of the ways that you can respond to this bigger social set of relations is in fact to succumb to nihilistic violence. And to me, it's like there's something important about understanding that that is a response to this without necessarily saying this is the proper response or the one that is most effective.
Yeah, that's why I don't think that this movie fits neatly into some sort of theme of like class conflict.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, I've definitely read those readings as well, and I don't think that, because the character himself doesn't embrace that. And I think that you could, I mean, I don't read the film this way, but I think that if that was your interpretation of what the meaning of the movie was, it could also be saying that basically these like anarchist heroes are like anything but actually, like they're essentially not working towards those goals. And so that's why I think that there's elements of, you know, talking about the peeling away of any like social programs and the things that would prevent people like Fleck from suffering like a great deal more.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't think that it's this very clear film about just like a class conflict of...
I mean, I guess I would almost describe it as anti-capitalist without necessarily being like socialist or communist. Like there's no positive vision of what an actual meaningful response would be to these conditions of austerity and the complete destruction of the social safety net, which is going to further brutalize people like Arthur Fleck. To me, I mean, the question would then be, you know, is that Todd Phillips very consciously offering a perspective, which is to say, you know, again, I keep coming back to capitalist realism. There is no alternative. It's like the only response to this is just mass violence. Or is it that it's outside the scope of the film to like offer any sort of positive vision of an alternative, or is that actually also symptomatic of the limitations of the film itself?
It's almost like a anarcho-nihilism, like that group.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah,
in Greece.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it. So Todd Phillips is smart because he toes the line of like, it's all revolutionary. Everything in the movie feels revolutionary and has that like that tinge of like, that's what the themes are here, right? And even I would argue even further in the idea of Fleck's sort of progression into madness, like you see him flirting with the idea of suicide, basically like throughout the entire movie. Like it seems like every time he
clearly planning it.
Yeah. Like every time he kind of plans to like go commit an act of violence, it's almost like he first conceives of it as like his own destruction, right?
Yeah, because whenever he first finds the gun, or he first gets the gun, one of the first things that he does is he sort of like puts it up to his up to his head, like he was actually.
Well, and then of course like the scene in the fucking elevator with
Zazie Beetz is
Zazie Beetz is her actress. Yeah. So like anyway, in the elevator she's like does the fucking I'm gonna shoot myself hand gesture to him, and then he fucking does weird shit in the hallway of
because the kid is being really annoying or something.
Yeah, you know, and there's like a part of me because he doesn't seem to exhibit those like suicidal thoughts until he has that encounter with her in the hallway, and then then he gets the gun, or maybe he gets it like right before that, and like it kind of seems to like incept this idea, I guess, for lack of a better term. And like even with the Murray show, when he's about to go on the Murray show, it kind of seems like if you watch him like practicing walking on from the stage and everything, it seems like what he was gonna do was tell the joke and then shoot himself in
that
the
was
head.
absolutely what he planned to do. Yeah,
and then he ended up doing the opposite, and then it's like fucking Joker is born kind of thing.
I will say like one of the things too about how in that moment, why he does decide to kill Murray instead of himself, there are a couple of really interesting things about that. The fact that he's sort of describing like how he's excluded and like people walk over people like him every day and don't give a shit. And he basically says, what do you get whenever you cross like a mentally ill person with a society that...
Yeah, with nothing to lose.
It's fucking, like brutal and mean to everyone. And he says, you get what you fucking deserve. And then he blows his head off. But right before that, like Murray makes this criticism of where he says, you're so full of like self-pity in all of this. And I think that is why, to me, again, to read this as a glorification of the Joker is just a really bad read of the film, because in some ways his response to this situation and this almost like weird kind of dialectical sort of way of saying, listen, there are like individual people with these potentials and these things, and then there's like the social conditions, and it's the interaction of the two that creates monsters like me. And basically at the end of the day, he's still absorbed in this sort of like narcissistic self-pity. And in a lot of ways, that is where his violence is coming from, is this sort of just glorification of himself. And maybe that to me is what's more interesting. I mean, he's definitely glorifying himself and this own fantasy that he lives in, but the film itself isn't glorifying that. It's actually saying in some sort of way, this is deeply nihilistic, narcissistic response to these sort of dialectical conditions of like social relations and kind of the individual. I also think that part of why it's really difficult to interpret the film that way is because all of a sudden it means that you as the viewer are implicated in the social conditions that create monsters, just like Joker. And I think that is actually part of why I think there's a lot of projection in how the film gets interpreted so far, is that it does in some sort of way like force you to recognize that we're all creating the conditions of this over and over again, every single moment of every day. And what would it mean to have to sort of implicate yourself in that sort of process of ongoing creation of these conditions day in and day out? And I think, again, it's sort of an interesting thing that the film poses that to you and like asks you to sort of wrestle with that.
To go back to that scene of like right before he shoots Murray, I think there is an interesting a piece as well of where it's specifically when he opens his notebook and sees that line of like, I hope my death makes more sense than my life, that it seems like he kind of changes his mind at that point, seeing that line, which I also thought was interesting as well.
Yeah, I was going to even, because now that we're talking about it, I kind of have this idea, but it's almost like there is a progressive, I mean, he kills a lot of people, right? Like he kills the 3 guys on the train, he kills his coworker, and he kills his mother, and then he kills Murray on the show.
And he kills his neighbor, Zazie Beetz' character and her son. Well, where it's implied that he kills them.
Oh, I didn't see that.
I was gonna say,
you think so?
I didn't think that he did.
Really? Okay, that's
he did
interesting
that.
because one of the hot takes that I sent y'all, they clearly interpreted him being in her apartment and then whenever he walks out, it's like him either sexually assaulted her or murdered her or some combination, which is maybe an interesting thing about how the film gets read whenever it's not actually implying that, or it's very ambiguous.
I don't think that fits with it, man. He just like stalked her. He was like just completely like obsessed with her. You know what I'm saying? Like he was in love with the idea of like her being in some way involved in his life because he like followed her around and like obviously like had considered going to her apartment like after he kills the first three dudes. Like his fantasy is like that he immediately goes to her apartment and has sex with her, or like, you know, makes out with her passionately.
Yeah.
So
I
don't think he
didn't read
murders
it.
her. No.
I don't think that there's
Interesting,
any, at least to me, there's no details that would suggest that we were supposed to read. I mean, I guess it was definitely ambiguous.
Yeah.
They usually
but
followed up with most of the violence, like the cops in the train. They then
Yeah.
later said those guys were in critical condition.
With the therapist at the end, like he obviously had
Yeah.
blood on his shoes. Like I just, to me, it was more of him realizing that this wasn't real, and this was like one more thing that he was like losing in his life, and like bringing him further.
Fuck,
to the
that's
breaking
even
point.
more sad. Like,
No, but that's the whole thing. That's
Yeah.
the thing that I was gonna say is like, so he systematically destroys all of the like, it's sort of like the names of the father, you could say. Like,
oh, there we
like,
go. I was waiting for us. I was like, we're gonna have to talk some Lacan about this.
Yeah,
shit.
but I mean, like, it's everyone. It's his mother,
Yep.
right? Then he also murders like I think his name is Al. Is his name Al? The guy that gives him the gun.
Yeah, the coworker
The
guy.
coworker. So,
Can I
like,
also say just the fact that the guy who plays the coworker also plays the murder at the end of True Detective season 1,
yeah.
which I just thought was kind of interesting. I'm just like, I can never see him in anything without just being
Like,
like,
being like a creep, like horrible.
yeah, just like horrible Epstein-esque, like part of that cabal, like mass murder as well. So I just thought that casting was really interesting that they picked him to play
Casting
that
for this
part.
movie was quite good in a lot of
really
it was
good.
Yeah.
good in a lot of ways, but yeah.
Yeah, Paperboy as the fucking guy in Arkham.
Still
with the
one of my
records.
favorite roles in the whole
So
film was
good.
Paperboy as the clerk.
Yeah.
But you were saying about like the names of the father and how he's,
Yeah.
like,
So like
systematically killing.
he kills his mother, right? And then it's like the people that are left to kill are Al, who is like the one who sort of initially gave him this idea of like violence as a solution to his problems, right? Because it doesn't seem like he was necessarily ever going to act violently until Al put a fucking gun in his hand. Now, I'm not trying to say that, you know, like fucking all the Twitter fucking trolls and be like, whoa, gun control, don't you see? We need gun control. No, fuck you. We don't need gun control. We just don't, you know, like this guy was obviously fucking mentally disturbed. Like, fuck you. It's also not an argument for like, we need more mental health. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like I'm falling into all the fucking liberal pitfalls of like, you know, we need to do something about guns. We don't. We need guns. Anyway, fuck you. So, like, all I'm saying.
That's an official statement from Red Library.
Red Library. Red Library, don't take my guns. No, but so he kills Al, who is the guy who like first incepted sort of the idea of like violence as a solution to some of these problems. He then goes on to murder Murray on the show, right? Very publicly and very like sort of in this wild Joker fashion,
Yeah.
right? But then
I mean,
think that
and Murray was like fantasized as being
as
like
his
a
father.
father.
Murray
It's like his
literally
father, yeah.
says to him in his own fantasy, like, I would be so happy if I had a son like you or something like that. And so it's like obviously another image of like the father. And then the one that actually incepts him into the Joker and makes him rise up or whatever, like from the fucking roof of or from the top of the police car, is when Thomas Wayne gets murdered by one of the thugs in the alley. In fact, they specifically put that scene just before the scene where Joker gets up and is like sort of born out of the ashes of the chaos in the streets.
Yeah.
And so I very, very heavily feel like that is like an intentional perspective. It's like only when all of these sort of figures of the father die off that Joker is able to like fully embrace his fantasy and become like this monstrous figure, which of course Lacan would say it's the one who like misinterprets all the names of the father, right? Who errs the most, right? Like los nom dupe err or whatever, like the stupid French puns that he always fucking makes. Fucking goddamn Lacan. But like, and so like
he was French. I mean, so.
yeah, he was fucking French. But I don't know. Anyway, it's the puns that I'm just like, why puns? Anyway.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting too, though, to think about how, in some ways, prior to him fully embracing this sort of like fantasy of the Joker and becoming, in some ways, I'm almost wondering which sort of discourse would he fit into then. I mean, is the Joker in some ways sort of the master? at the end?
No, he's very much like the subject. He's very much like just a person who was tempted by his fantasies so deeply and continued to compromise on that like separation between reality and fantasy and eventually ended up in a nightmare of his own creation, you know?
Well, I think that in some ways I've been doing a lot of reading from like Melanie Klein and like object relations lately. Okay. So, you know, a different sort of school than Lacanian psychoanalysis, but one I think that sort of is interesting to like put these in conversation with each other through the film. You know, going back to the scene in the elevator, how his first contact with Zazie Beetz' character is through the symbol of like pointing the gun to your head and like dying by suicide and like, you know, putting a bullet through your head. And it's interesting that he doesn't know like how to relate to that. But whenever he walks out of the elevator and he turns around and he like mimics the motion to her, it's really interesting because to me, thinking about it in terms of relational aspects of like human experience, there's this way that he's trying to actually relate to her or find some sense of like communication through this like gesture of like mimicry of her and like trying to mimic her gesture. And so, you know, part of like how he goes through and murders all these characters is in some ways like he's murdering all the things that he is relating to, that sort of like structure, or almost help him repress the aspects of his fantasy that will eventually become completely unencumbered and just completely destructive and nihilistic. And so there's also this interesting way that as he's like destroying like the names of the father, he's also in some ways destroying like the only context of actually how to relate to other people that he has. Destroys his relationship with his mother, who was also, obviously, he was completely determined in his daily experience by her own delusions and narcissism and how everything in his life was just to basically serve her and her delusions and fantasies. So it's just
my like conspiracy alarms are going off in my head right now. I like really, really want to talk about the potential that Thomas Wayne, as like a rich billionaire, absolutely did like send her to the asylum and like get her to seem like a crazy person by having somebody go beat her up and shit to like make it seem like that kid wasn't actually his, so he didn't have to like deal with it. Because there's nothing to like, it's perfectly ambiguous in the movie. I don't think that there's really anything that indicates one way or another other than like narration that you get from like a, you know, faulty narrator. But like,
so let's talk about this for a second, because I mean, just for anyone, you know, who's listening and is fine with spoilers but hasn't seen the film. So basically, Fleck's mother worked for the Waynes, worked for Thomas Wayne like 30 years prior, was fired or was let go for some unknown reason, or it's very ambiguous, but the idea is that essentially she and Thomas Wayne had an affair, and then Arthur Fleck was his kid, or that's what she tells him.
Yeah. So that was the mother's narrative that she told.
She doesn't.
Or he learns about it.
Yeah, she's like writing letters to Thomas Wayne constantly, and then one day he comes home and he just decides to read one, and it's just like, your son and I need your help, Thomas, and like that's when he finds out.
So to me, I think one of the most fascinating things about that part of the film is that there's this interesting like sort of relationship where Fleck is struggling with understanding if he is Thomas Wayne's biological son. But I think what's kind of really fascinating about it is that even if he's not, he's sort of symbolically his son, because them living in poverty, everything that's happened to him in some way it's an effect of the exact sort of social conditions of like class and everything else that also Thomas Wayne is absolutely the figurehead of. So to me, that sort of relationship between, is he actually his son, or is he also like symbolically his son through the sort of relations of class, and how whether they actually had an affair or not, I mean, Arthur Fleck's life is in effect like really influenced and sort of like determined by what happened with Wayne firing his mom in some sort of way.
So many things I want to say in response to this. Okay, so like this is like the scene that precedes Arthur Fleck's character going to the Wayne Manor like fucking just like putting on a weird magician clown act for fucking young Batman, basically. Fucking reaches through the gate and like puts his fingers in his mouth and like makes him smile, and I'm just like, what the
I mean, I did like after the movie, I was, if Batman became Batman because like he was afraid of bats when he was a kid, I feel like in this universe he'd be like
afraid of clowns,
like like that's strangers' fingers in my mouth, man, or something like that.
Strangers' fingers.
It's like that's what haunts him when he goes to be trained by Ra's al Ghul. It's like if you were to like splice the universes of this film if you were to splice the universe of this film with Nolan's Batman, it's like whenever he gets like the fucking orchid like PCP blown in his face and he hallucinates his deepest fear, it's literally just some middle-aged man just putting his fingers in his mouth.
The reason I bring that up, well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but like it invokes, so like there's so many movies that this made me think of, right? Like 1 Hour Photo, like I was telling you before. There's a scene in 1 Hour Photo where Robin Williams' character, he like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen fucking 1 Hour Photo. It's a little dated
a long
now,
time ago.
but it's really fucking good.
Yeah.
You should watch it. If you like Robin Williams, it's like him in like a serious psychopath role, kind of like Foxcatcher or like, but he plays a clerk at like one of those old school like film development kiosks, like supermarket. Develop your photos in 1 hour. I mean, it never was that fucking fast when I used to go to those, like an hour, seriously, like that's so fast. But anyway, fuck it, like it's
we take
not
controversial positions on the show, like we hardcore critique the wait times.
The wait time is a lie. The wait time is a fucking lie. But so he becomes obsessed with this family in 1 Hour Photo. He sees them when they shop in the fucking supermarket, and there's like a scene where the little kid wants to buy a toy, and I remember specifically because it was like a fucking Evangelion fucking robot that the kid wants to buy.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and like his dad tells him no. Sorry, I'm like spinning. His dad tells him no, and then Robin Williams' character, the like weird psychopath that's like stalking them through their photos, ends up buying the toy and like coming to one of the kids' like baseball games or some shit, and like he like gifts it to him and like gives it, and he's like, hey, here's that toy your dad wouldn't get you, you know, like, kid, how you doing? And like everybody's like looking at him like, hey kid, who the fuck's this, you know? And it's like, and so when I saw that scene, it reminded me of 1 Hour Photo. And like the thing that I was gonna say was, it's interesting that we're talking about Thomas Wayne, right? Because like if Fleck's perception is that he was abandoned by his father, right? Because he's obviously growing up fatherless, and he's kind of searching for these father figures everywhere throughout the movie. It's interesting that he would be so attracted to his neighbor down the hall, right? Because she's like a single mother raising a kid. She's obviously impoverished. She's obviously got a lot of stress going on in her life. She seems like somebody who's got a lot on her plate, but he like fantasizes about like the quality of like her as a person and how beautiful. I mean, she is actually very beautiful, but like, you know, like it's interesting that he'd be drawn towards that, considering that he's looking for that position of like paternity, right? Yeah. And like it's a homologue to like what he experiences with his own mother, and I guess he puts himself in that position.
Yeah, and there's a way that like she, in his fantasies throughout the film, she fills this role of this sort of loving, supportive character who's there with him when his mom has had a stroke and is in the hospital. Yeah. And so the role that she plays in his fantasy is, it's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, sort of further encourages him to like distance himself from his mother and sort of pursue this narrative of like maybe what she told me isn't real, which sort of culminates in him murdering her.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, just to come back to sort of thinking a lot about object relations as a way to read this film. I mean, in some sort of way, part of what he does with his mom is that there's a sort of projective identification function happening where like his mother's delusions and narcissism really in a lot of ways like structure like his own sense of self and subjectivity. And in some ways, like the fantasy of Zazie Beetz' character is helping him in some ways like disconnect from that or like find a sense of agency and subjectivity that's outside of his mother's own experience. Yep. And so in some ways like that fantasy of her plays this really necessary role to not only like step into the shoes of him being the father and like, you know, the loving husband, and also to like find that sense of freedom of how to actually disconnect himself from his mother's own delusion about who his father is and what his role is and what his whole subjectivity is based around. Yeah,
you could say she was like his Tyler Durden in a sense. There's even those scenes, and they're not done as well as like David Fincher, but like there's those scenes where when he's having that revelation of like she was never really there. He's like sitting in her apartment and he's all dripping wet, and then he's like, oh fuck, like, you know, she's like, I need you to leave, and she's all freaked out, and like he just has these like memories of like, oh, when I was sitting in the hospital with my mom, and then she's there in one scene and then she's not in the next scene, and then it's like, or then the shot, and then like when they're walking through the streets and he's like looking at the killer clown face, and then she's there and then she's not. Once again, a tie-in to another movie that this movie invoked like so many scenes from other movies that I kind of was like, wow, this is kind of cool. Like I felt like it was, that's why I said it felt more like a film, like it was in the repertoire of films that I've seen, not something that I readily would put in the category of like superhero movie or like origin story or like whatever the fuck, like big budget, you know, superhero shit.
Well, I think the most obvious comparison I've heard people make is this to Taxi Driver.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that one's obvious.
Well, one of my favorite things just in terms of the general reaction to it is that, oh, this movie is just like Taxi Driver, like some rehash of Taxi Driver, so I'm not going to go see it. It's been done.
Yeah, I love that you can like only tell a story one time.
That's right.
In the history of
That's definitely how story works.
There's only one Taxi Driver, and I stick by that one. Fuck Joaquin Phoenix.
It's literally like, oh, well, they already made Taxi Driver. Well, I guess I'm not going to make another film that could have similar themes 40 years later.
But I gotta say, man, the thematic elements, like there's like, direct testament to Taxi Driver, the fucking scene where he puts his hand up against his head covered in blood, where De Niro like just killed the pimps and all the fucking, and he's like laying in the bed and chick's all freaked out and he just puts his fucking finger up to his head covered in blood, pulls a trigger kind of thing. Like that's not a nod. I don't know what fucking is, it's definitely I think it self-aware.
I guess like what strikes me as interesting to sort of critique it as if it's just like a remake of Taxi Driver and then dismiss it because of that is in some ways completely jettisoning the idea that maybe the reason why this story still has relevance is not just because of its ode to, this like great film and cinema history, but because the conditions that it's responding to are still present and that they're still relevant to respond to. And maybe like this story is, again, a similar way to respond to these kinds of conditions. I mean, the film was set in the early 80s, right? I mean, that actually isn't too far off in the same general time frame as when Taxi Driver actually takes place. So to me, I think that's kind of what's more relevant is that why is it that this story still has relevance and maybe still resonates enough to be told, even if it takes this like weird sort of like surprising form of a fucking Joker movie of all things.
I was going to go back to the discussion of Thomas Wayne.
Let's do it. Fuck Thomas Wayne.
Fuck the man. Kill the rich. Fucking eat him.
I mean, what did you guys think of the portrayal of him? Was it supposed to be like definitely negative or... I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that he was like a huge asshole for punching him in the, and I was kind of like, I actually feel like in the realm of like what is sort of, I mean, this guy came to your house, like stuck his finger in your kid's mouth, then you like stalk him in the bathroom, and then like basically like accost him and stuff like that, and I don't know. Like, I think that there's other aspects of his character that like he's clearly.
Are you trying to say critical support for Thomas Wayne?
I mean, I think in this one part, right? I would say I don't think he's like completely unjustified in doing that.
I mean, Fleck is completely fucking losing his shit at this point. I mean, he's, like despite his empathetic sort of portrayal early in the film, I mean, he's also just. He has like no ability to relate to people like in any way that fits into the prevailing social norms, say whatever you will about that.
But I think his portrayal is still supposed to be still, even if those are somewhat justified, they're supposed to be like negative in some cases, right? So like I think when he's talking like in front of the cameras and stuff like that, and do you guys remember exactly what he said like about like basically the people who like don't like produce any or like don't make
he was kind of he said something like that's really fitting that the guy was wearing a clown mask or dressed up like a clown because that's kind of what these people are. It's so embarrassing to like be someone who's so so cowardly or something like that. And then he said like people who don't contribute to society are clowns.
Yeah,
and,
they're
like,
a bunch of
appropriate.
clowns.
They're a bunch of clowns.
Yeah.
And so then it's like starts the whole movement of like rioters all dressed like clowns, which was really beneficial to fucking Arthur Fleck's character throughout the movie, because if it wasn't for those guys, like he would have gotten caught many, many times before he accomplished anything.
Well, I guess I would say like two things. I actually think what's interesting about Thomas Wayne's portrayal is that his statements and like his responses to Fleck, especially when he approaches him in the bathroom, I think leave you to definitely see Thomas Wayne as a figure who is this like hyper elite 1%er who does feel that he's of a completely different species as like most of the fucking like poor and impoverished and excluded people in Gotham. So there's this way that he definitely represents that sort of class interest of just not even seeing yourself as like the same fucking species as like the people who are directly brutalized by the system that you benefit from. And at the same time, Fleck is also completely fucked in a different way. Like they're two aspects of the same system in some sort of way. And so I think that to me, that scene is interesting because it's almost like, well, one is like a completely deranged fucking killer, and the other one is a complete piece of shit 1%er capitalist who thinks the rest of the city is just fucking vermin for not contributing. So to me, it's almost like they're both terrible at that point in the film, and that's how I read it.
Yeah, I mean, like, so how's this for a fucking hot take? I guess, like, in my perspective, Thomas Wayne is like, it's almost as though this movie has reduced the entire conflict between Joker and Batman into just like libs versus Republicans kind of thing. Like, he's like, Thomas Wayne was the one who is like truly capital, like he both gave birth to the Joker and Batman, possibly, you know, or like gave birth symbolically to the Joker, regardless of whether he actually paternally gave birth to him, or not gave birth. He didn't give birth to anyone, but like whatever, inseminated whoever gave birth to them. And like,
I think our listeners can figure it out.
Yeah, you know how sex works, right? Like you do that thing and then babies. And so he both incepted both of those ideas and is like the main antagonist to all of Gotham, in the sense that like the wealth disparity and like the injustices and like mental health and like all of like the sort of outcry of like we need reform in our city and all this shit is like the background against which like almost every single villain and every single hero in Gotham like appears, right? Like, and family and like repression of like trauma and all these things are like definitely present in that entire legacy, right? And at the end of the day, you can trace it all back to fucking Thomas Wayne. So in that context, going on like what you said, Don, like, yeah, maybe Thomas Wayne was just kind of like an old school stand up, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of like dude from the 80s who was just like, oh, fuck you, you know, and fucking crazy hippie, and like punched him in the face. That wasn't really all that bad. Maybe that attitude is like what a lot of people think is like the solution to like a lot of the problems of today, you know, like, oh, just like stand up and pull yourself up and stop being a bitch. But like, I don't think that it's justifiable in the context of what Thomas Wayne actually contextually made, you know, like where he is actually positioned in terms of like the aftermath of this movie, and not only this movie but like the entire city of Gotham. Fuck Thomas Wayne.
Well, so let's the other thing I wanted to touch on was in relation to Thomas Wayne and the Joker and sort of what they're these almost like sort of embodied representations of in larger social forces. I actually think that, again, I mean, I'm not sure how much this was intended in the actual making of the film, but I think one of the limitations that the film either consciously or unconsciously portrays is how these larger social relations and forces get represented as individuals. And the way that Thomas Wayne symbolizes capital and social inequality and wealth disparity and like this horrible, brutal, violent system and those who benefit from it. And at the end of the day, though, it's still all embodied in this one figure. Despite what the film implies, it never directly says anything about what is the system that is creating this horrible austerity and like brutal violence that not only is about the top versus the bottom, but it's also the way that it affects how people relate to each other who are in the impoverished and underclasses, and like how that's racialized and like gendered in different ways. So to me, the way that Wayne embodies this sort of the forces of capital and the relations of capital, Joker as this like nihilistic figure who's sort of lashing out at this in a really kind of his own narcissistic sort of way, ends up becoming the sort of embodied figure of resistance to these exact same social forces of capital. And I think if there's an interesting sort of read about the potential sort of left-wing message that you could take from this, if you do, it would be that Joker essentially becomes this figurehead of these sort of like chaotic, anarchist, violent responses to it. But in the end, like, he doesn't actually symbolize anything that's interested in resisting the forces of capital in like a communal way that's built on solidarity and like sort of class consciousness. Like, it's not that, but he is the embodiment of some kind of resistance, but it's nothing that actually poses any sort of real response outside of just lashing out. And so to me, that's kind of interesting, the way that like they sort of both end up embodying in these single figures these larger social forces that are at play in the background that are never really named. I mean, even the riots and shit, like, they're never talked about as commie or like anarchists or anything else. They're just these like vague social forces operating in the background. And the film is still, at the end of the day, really about individuals, you know, individual characters in these like very sort of very discrete relationships.
Yeah, man. Obviously the riot is all juggalos, right? Like, whoop whoop.
Right here, whoop whoop.
Like, I mean, that's obviously
Whoop,
what
whoop
you're supposed to
indeed,
take from
sir.
this movie, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Listen to ICP.
You know, that's actually a good point. Where are the Juggalo hot takes on this film? Like, that's what I want.
I like
I
how
know,
no one ever was like, oh, juggalos. Yeah, this has already been done. You know, like, no.
so derivative.
It's derivative, man. Come on. ICP was doing this years ago.
Let's talk about Charlie Chaplin.
Oh,
Ooh,
yeah.
yeah.
So I know that only one hot take I've read about the film mentions the comparison between Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of Joker in terms of his physical presence, the way he acts, and the connection between that and Charlie Chaplin and the screening of Modern Times that all the elite 1%ers go to near the end of the film. So I know we kind of mentioned this briefly after we saw it the other night, but I was curious if y'all had any other like thoughts or what your take was on the connection between Chaplin and Joker.
I thought you had some ideas. You talking about it, yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, so I'll say, okay, so if I can fucking take this. So Modern Times, like, you know, we had kind of a conversation about this when we first watched it, just briefly afterwards. Modern Times was like the first instance of Charlie Chaplin doing a movie where he like spoke. I think prior to that, all of his movies, he was just only on film. And like I think they're always like they have like musical scores, but like I think Charlie Chaplin actually has like speaking parts in Modern Times, which is like interesting in the context of the movie, because to me, it almost seemed like there was a thematic of like both dancing and the sort of intrusion of the laughter, right? If you were to think of the dancing and the laughter as like the burgeoning of this new era of like maniacal like nihilism that like was going to like sort of be brought upon by the birth of the Joker, you could kind of compare that strange slapsticky like self-deprecating humor to like Charlie Chaplin's like strange slapsticky humor. I don't know how else to put it, but like Charlie Chaplin, I think that it's intentional that you see the scene of like the rich people all sitting around watching Modern Times right before the confrontation between Arthur Fleck's character and Thomas Wayne, because like in a sense that's when you kind of could say that he decides that he's ready to sort of like move on from this idea of like Thomas Wayne as possibly his father, and like searching for that like validation as a human being, and just like fully succumbing to like, fuck this, like I'm just gonna be violent and just do whatever brutality I think is appropriate. There's a degree to which I feel like Charlie Chaplin also had to succumb to, this is the way that movies are moving. There's no longer going to be silent films. This is like how everything is, like the direction everything is going. And all of these people, these like rich old cats that are like in fucking like suits watching fucking movies,
Tuxedos
like tuxedo suits watching movies, like why the fuck? And so they're all watching like this sort of antiquated movie. I mean, it's the fucking late 70s or 80s in this movie. Like why the fuck are they watching Modern Times? Like, I mean, that was an old ass movie at that point, and like it's strange. You can kind of see them all stuck in this.
I occasionally go watch old movies at theaters. I mean,
that is true. I also do that. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't watch them in a fucking tuxedo with a top hat on, dude.
Well, that's only because I don't own one.
It's like, don't at me, bro.
Yeah, if I owned one, I would absolutely go see like Metropolis and like a fucking tuxedo and a fucking top hat.
Don't get me wrong, like whatever the fuck, you know. I'm not saying old movies are bad, but like, you know. But also, there's a thing that I almost want to bring up, because I'm sort of like confused as to whether, because it's like difficult. You can't necessarily trust in all of the things that you see as like legit scenes in that movie. Like there are whole sequences of scenes that end up being sort of like in retrospect shown to be like fictions, you know, just like his imagination running wild.
I've read some interpretations that some people think that actually like when he's in the cop car, basically like when the ambulance hits and stuff, that's like all imagined by him.
Yeah, that's
and
like
basically
a fantasy
just
sequence.
Exactly. And so basically it just goes right from being in the cop car to like Arkham.
Yeah.
But that whole like ending scene where he rises up is a fantasy.
Yeah.
What if the whole film was actually what Tim Robbins' character hallucinates right before he dies in Jacob's Ladder?
The whole movie is a Jacob's Ladder remake.
A very bad hot take that was basically just like, oh yeah, he probably was just in Arkham the entire time, and just imagine the whole thing.
Yeah, he's just
like,
sitting in his cell in Arkham, rocking back and forth.
Sure, but who gives a shit?
There's
like,
some credence. There's some credence to that, because in the very like probably the fucking second scene of the movie where he's talking to the social worker, one of the first things she asks him is like, "So did you think about like being in Arkham anymore?"
Oh, and
there's like a small
like
flash of him
head.
like smashing his head into the window at Arkham, and like they just gloss over it. He doesn't say anything, and they don't give any justification like why he was in there. So it's totally possible that he's just been in and out of fucking Arkham, and that this guy is just like completely delusional and just imagining this entire scenario, which I think is a little far-fetched, because I think the way that the movie frames it doesn't really imply that, if you were to really look at how those scenes are put into context later. But there is a degree to which I like don't know if I can trust some of his perspective. And like when he's in that theater and he's like watching Charlie Chaplin, you can see that like all of the people in the crowd look like super uniform, like they all look exactly the same and they're all laughing at the exact same moments, and it doesn't seem like they're real people, kind of like the crowd was when he was in the Murray show at the beginning when he's fantasizing next to his mother, and like all the crowd is just like, oh, and they all like cheer together and they all like encourage him, and they're all like just like blank face, like sitting around and not doing anything. That was actually a thing that like one of the fucking YouTube people had brought up, that like when he seems to be having those like moments of like complete fantasy, like everybody around him seems to just fall into this weird conformity of like not being real or having responses to like his actions. That scene maybe was a little ambiguous.
Are you basically saying that everyone becomes an NPC?
Yeah, exactly. Like you're trying to interact with them, like sell me some fucking goddamn weapons. I don't know if you can necessarily trust that, but it is the scene that immediately precedes him talking to Thomas Wayne. Also, just music as a theme throughout the movie, like in the very, very last scene where he's talking to the woman in the asylum, who looks surprisingly like his original social worker. I don't know if that was intentional, but like I was almost confused for a second. She has like similar hairstyle, and she's also like very stone faced and like doesn't really say much. But like anyway, he says like, oh, I was thinking of this joke, and then he's like, oh, you wouldn't get it, and then all of a sudden the fucking Frank Sinatra That's Life like breaks through, and he's like mouthing the words, and you can tell that like in his head this music is playing, and it's the music that was playing when he was like dyeing his hair green and just like doing the fantastical dance down the fucking stairs in his like Joker outfit. So it kind of seems to me like the intrusion of that sort of sound into cinema, like that whole theme from Modern Times of like, and Modern Times too, he's like a working class dude who's just having like failure after failure, right? Like trying to work in the factory, and like, I don't know, there's some very heavy thematic overlap there.
To me, I think the way that we look back in a common reading of Modern Times is the way that Chaplin's physical acting and physical movements in Modern Times are mimicking the sort of speeding up or acceleration of production and machinery and communication, and the way that we are responding to that in a very physical, embodied sort of way. And I think whenever I try to understand how could we sort of put a word to that particular depiction of the speeding up of day-to-day life in Modern Times, right, for Chaplin, it's this sort of technological accelerationism that our bodies and our lives and our experiences are being structured in these very material ways by technology itself. And whenever I look at Joker and I try to ask myself that, okay, it seems pretty obvious. I mean, the film has very blatant inclusions of Chaplin in Modern Times in the film. And just to, let's say, give the film credit enough that it's very consciously juxtaposing Joker and Chaplin in the way that they're responding to these social forces. So I would ask myself, like, what is it that Joker is embodying in his own physical movements in the way that he uses dance and physical acting? And it's almost like this sort of like corrosive deceleration, I guess I would say, or this sort of complete breakdown. If Chaplin is symbolizing the way that technology is speeding up society and production, to me, what's so brilliant about how Phoenix physically portrays the Joker is the way that it's sort of embodying this complete destruction of society and human relations in the way that his physical body responds to violence and brutality, and how he finds the full embodiment of him as the fantasy that is Joker is also told in this way that his body is sort of also responding to that in a way.
Yeah, it's like definitely the scene. So like when he walks into the theater, Arthur Fleck's character walks into the theater dressed as the usher, and like the scene that he's looking at on the screen of Modern Times is specifically when Charlie Chaplin is like blindfolded on roller skates, like, you know, and it does absolutely look like accelerated, like, you know, like they put it in fast motion or something, right? Or like fast forward, I mean, and like he's like slowly getting closer and closer to falling off of the like banister ledge, you know, onto the, you know, the floor below, and like the crowd is laughing every time he gets close to falling, which is like, I don't know, also thematically relevant, because I mean, this dude is like falling into madness, you know. It's like the big thematic of the stairs, right? Like every day after fucking his job, and he comes home, he has to fucking walk up those fucking huge stairs, that's giant staircase that like leads up to where his apartment building is, I guess. And then when he finally descends into madness, how he just fucking like does this like dick
dances
thrust,
down the
like
stairs,
kick
yeah.
dance down the fucking stairs.
Relentlessly.
Yeah, and so that's absolutely like, and I agree about the like jerky movements and stuff. Like, he has these like slow buildups to these like over the top like fucking thrusts and kicks and like jerks, and like he's very much like a both I'm trying to like be bigger than I am and like show the world that like I can lash out, but like at the same time exhibiting my own like self-destruction. You know, he is throughout the movie, his like physicality, like Joaquin Phoenix's physicality is like very strange. He's like so tense all the time. Like, I don't know if that's just his fucking body, but like Joaquin Phoenix's like shoulder throughout the movie, anytime he has his shirt off, he's like a fucking crazy, weird, like popped out shoulder. Yeah, just like a lot of contortion and like strange tension that he always seems to be embodying. Even when he walks and stuff and he runs, you can kind of see he's like this big, gangly, awkward dude. And so, yeah, I like that. And reading of like the mechanism of like capital sort of like crushing itself on its own, like upon its own weight, or like falling in on its own weight kind of thing. Maybe deceleration.
That was good.
Well, I guess
that's yep, I agree.
We all concur. All right, that's our official Red Library statement.
I mean, do we want to at least touch on the whole like Joker as a symbol for like white shooter, like white mass shooters or something like that?
Fucking the incel shit.
All right, so I actually wanted to start off this particular point with describing our actual experience going to the theater. So whenever we saw this at actually an undisclosed theater in an undisclosed place. Try not to dox everybody. But whenever we saw it, there was obviously, I think, a lot of tension, and there was an armed security guard in the theater. And there was something reflecting on that really struck me. The idea that this film in and of itself would be the thing that somehow flips a switch in someone's mind that would make them decide to commit an act of mass violence. And to me, it's sort of it was interesting to think about that, because in some ways it mimics the exact sort of depiction of social relations that the film itself is showing, is that there are these huge social forces that are going on that are very ambiguous, that we have a hard time even naming. And our response to that is not any sort of like proactive posing of any sort of alternative or addressing of the real forces that are driving this violence. It's just this kind of response to, like, all we can do is respond to it by like trying to protect ourselves even more and like making sure that we have a security guard in the theater. And to me, I don't know, it's just, I'm not even really sure what I completely make of it, but there's something about it that strikes me that it's sort of reflecting the exact limitation that the film itself is showing about what it is that creates monsters in this society. Because that to me is like really what I keep coming back from in the film, is like, how exactly do you understand the relationship between individual and like someone's family and the larger social forces that create something like what Arthur Fleck becomes? And in some ways, if it is a floating signifier for like white mass terrorism and violence, the way that we respond to the film is the exact same thing that we do to Joker, which is not to actually address the larger social forces that create monsters like him. We just essentially try to protect ourselves as much as we can from the effects of those social forces. That was kind of my thought about it, the more I reflected on just our experience in the theater itself.
To me, I had like several responses to this. One, which is this, I mean, he's clearly not like just a mass killer in this film, right? Like his violence is very much directed at specific people around him. Yeah, usually people that had, first off, you have the three people, the three guys on the subway who like literally, bankers. They're like literally attack him.
Yeah,
not to mention after they attack him after they like seemingly were planning to assault that woman until she fucking got up and walked away, and then they're like, "Oh, fuck you, bitch," and then they like go to beat him up.
Yeah, and then most of the other violence was like his mom, his coworker, and then Murray. These were all like people that he thought had definitely like done him some injustice or something like that. Which is not to say that like mass shooters definitely don't have this like sense of injustice or something like that was done to them, but it's generally directed at amorphous group of people or something group of people or something like that. Another thing is just because he's the protagonist doesn't necessarily mean that it's
I think you mean protagonist.
Yeah, protagonist. Yeah. doesn't mean that it's like necessarily a defense or like a positive portrayal of him.
Absolutely.
And I think that this is, I think we've mentioned it before on the show, but this definitely reminds me of something like Eichmann in Jerusalem. Of this tries to at least give an explanation or like a better idea of how this person was thinking and why he did what he did. And if you do that, then that must mean that you are giving like a defense of what they did, or are unable to then label what they did as evil. Like I have like a friend coworker that I've gotten into like many arguments about, because for him it's like if your position on morality is not that it's like scientifically objective or something like that, then there's no way that you can speak out, against what people did. And so if you can't say that, what the Nazis did was like scientifically and objectively wrong, then you're not able to actually say that, like, to make any moral claim against them. And for me, it's like, no, you're never able to do that. Like there's always a way in which you have to be, even if you understand why somebody did something, even if you like understand their like headspace, you can still sit there and say, no, what they did was like absolutely evil.
So I'm curious, two questions for you on that. Number one, what would be the moral framework that someone would be utilizing to make that claim? Is it some sort of like biological determinist idea of morality?
That's
the book that you should read is The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, are we talking
First
Sam Harris?
books we will burn with revolution.
Yeah. That's not far off from this. Yeah. So,
okay. All right.
So there's a whole lot of other issues with that, but it's still, I think that
so many.
Just this idea that
hashtag fuck Sam Harris, hashtag fuck new atheism, hashtag fuck the what do they call the dark enlightenment, like all these fucks. I'm sorry. Fuck that whole perspective. Sorry, Don, go ahead.
No,
I
you're
just
fine.
needed to express how much I fucking hate that ideology.
No, I think it was more of the reason why I was connecting them was this sort of idea that even if we understand what was going on, and whether it's the Joker's head or in like Eichmann, which, don't get me wrong, I disagree with some of Hannah Arendt's like interpretations of Eichmann and stuff like that. But I still think that the response to it, which was basically like, by writing this explanation of why he did why he thought he did, it must mean that you are siding with him, even though she's basically like, no, he absolutely should be executed, and he was evil. It's almost like if you basically just don't, if you say your only response should be, these people are completely insane and mad, and there's like no explanation for it. Like that's the only way that you can label something as being evil.
To me, what's also very interesting about this, and I'm really glad you brought up Eichmann in Jerusalem and sort of the response to Arendt writing about that, is, to me, I want to step back and ask, what must be your philosophical assumptions about how morality functions, how ideology works, what it is that actually generates particular kinds of horrible, violent behaviors, to then say that to even depict it in any sort of way is in fact to either glorify it, identify with it, or allow it to happen or contribute to it happening, by saying even to try to understand it is in itself to validate it in a certain way. Now, I think it's interesting to connect it to Eichmann in Jerusalem, because I think in some ways part of me is like, the culture war has been going on long before the 70s and 80s in some certain sense. To me, this is about a particular understanding of what culture is. Because, right, like Eichmann in Jerusalem wasn't just this disembodied thing. It was written, serially in a paper, right?
Yeah. I think for the New York Times.
Yeah, I thought it was the Times.
Yeah.
So even like Eichmann in Jerusalem was initially written as a piece of journalism. And so there's a way that whenever we step back and ask ourselves, okay, if we think that to portray or try to understand what it is that is happening in a film like Joker, and to say that, we're inherently glorifying it, my question is to say, how must you understand the world to think that to even show a character and try to like portray it the way that Joker is portrayed is in itself to glorify it? Like, what does that say? And I think it tells me that you must think that in some ways, the way that you understand like film and cultural production and depictions of very important aspects of, hashtag society, but is to say that like if I center a particular character, that in itself is to glorify it and validate it.
Personally, like, think that simply comes from like a lack of people's understanding of class relations, and like it's like a reductionist viewpoint that like the only thing that's wrong with society is that people are bad to one another, and that if we right here, all the people that we know, we were all just like good to one another, and we were all happy and like comfortable around each other, then there would be be no violence in the world, and like as though systemic oppression doesn't exist, and as though like the economy and like the influence of capital don't matter at all. It's just about like people on an individual, hyper individualistic level being decent to one another.
You know what's so fascinating about
perspective that people have? So when they watch a movie like this, they're like, oh, well, you must be glorifying Joaquin Phoenix's like life because like I don't know anything about like how systemic oppression can affect a person.
I have to tell you, I think it's so important that you just said that, because in a way, I think this is part of the like projection that people put onto this film, which is to say that that is how we understand things. And what's so funny about that is that Joker himself, Arthur Fleck's character, has no social, like larger systemic understanding. His whole way of understanding what has been done to him is that people are mean and brutal to each other. He says that right before he fucking blows off like Murray's head.
Yep.
His whole way of understanding his predicament is not through some larger systemic oppression. Not really. It's very amorphous.
He literally says, I don't believe in anything. Like when Murray asks him like, oh, are you dressed up as a clown because of the protest? And he's like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in anything.
Well, in some ways, like, that's what we're projecting onto the film, is this feeling of really it's just about these sort of very individual interactions and like how we're so shitty and violent to each other. And maybe that's part of what is like how that's being filtered or how that's being interpreted in the film, is that you must also believe that in some sort of way to then read the film. It's in some way, it's like you are the Joker. You know, we are the Joker. Like there is no society. Like there's just these individual relations and people being shitty and mean to each other, which they are.
It's fucking meta.
Yeah, but to like accept that as the understanding of these larger social forces is in itself to fall prey to the exact ideology that Arthur Fleck operates on.
If I could disagree with myself just a few minutes ago, and maybe not necessarily, I don't want to be devil's advocate here.
I was about to say, are you playing devil's advocate?
Do it.
I mean, I think that and I would say that this is maybe representative of like a deep like sickness or problem in American society, of where like.
Sorry, I just heard down with the sickness playing in my head. Sorry.
To where like, I mean, maybe there is a way in which like so much of American society is obsessed with just like attention.
Yep.
And the idea of like this is what everybody wants is specifically like a film made of them. And so if you make a film about a character, even if the portrayal is negative,
society of spectacle kind of thing.
Yeah. Like even if the portrayal is negative, maybe there is a way in which, you know, people can watch that and say, well, if I want, you know, people to, you know, notice me, senpai. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
That, you know, maybe this is the way to do it. I don't know. So I guess if that was like, if I had to maybe at least see part of what, but I don't think that the takes are ever ever flesh that out really. I think it's more of just like, this portrayal is like positive or something like that.
That's very true.
I think you're exactly right about this, because the whole point of like Fleck's character, and I know we haven't touched on this a ton, but the experience of him being brutally traumatized and abused by like his mother's, I guess, boyfriend, and thereby like she also was emotionally and psychologically abusing him as well. It wasn't physical, but it was also abusive. But there's a way that, I mean, just for a second, I want to talk about like a therapist who works specifically with these kind of issues. I mean, one of the most horrible, tragic effects of those kind of experiences is to literally make you think that you aren't real. Dissociation, the way that you have to psychologically process those things just to preserve any sense of like a coherent psyche, is more often than not to make you feel that like you're not actually real, you're not seen, like you don't actually exist in some deeply existential way, because it's a way that you preserve any ability to function at all.
And I mean, doesn't he have a line that's almost exactly that when he's talking with his therapist?
I thought I didn't exist. Until now, and now people will see that I'm here, and like
he's here, and everything like that line. I mean, the comedy and the violence itself. I think. Again, I don't know how you should like, if this in a way is a legitimate point to critique the film on, but what it does depict is whenever you feel that you don't even exist and that you're completely forgotten and not seen by anyone, whatever means you can find to make you feel a sense of power in a world where it feels that power is never anything that you have over your own life in any meaningful way, violence over other people and brutality becomes a way to feel powerful. To me, I think there's something really terrifying and scary to have to reckon with that. That in a lot of ways, like, violence absolutely is a very intoxicating form of power. And that in the end is like Flex, what he succumbs to is that just completely brutal violence is the most meaningful way he's found to confirm that he exists in the world that thinks that he is just complete garbage and completely worthy of being forgotten.
I was going to say there's something interesting about the way that the movie is shot, right? Because when we're talking about this kind of like the intrusion of trauma into people's lives and how it can make you feel like you don't exist and things like that, there's a degree to which, like, I'm not sure how to read it, but the way I interpret it is like in all of the moments when you think that you're seeing the brutality of Arthur Fleck's character and the camera doesn't shy away from showing you that brutality, like when he shoots Murray in the head, it doesn't pull away. There's no like bang with like a sudden cut scene. It's like you see him lying there in the fucking chair and you see the blood splatter on the wall. When he stabs Al with the fucking scissors, it's like one of the most brutal fucking scenes. You know, stabs him in the fucking face and then crushes his head against the wall. Like, it's fucking horrible. Like, they don't pull away. You see everything. Even in the aftermath, he's sitting there covered in blood when he's talking to the dwarf guy.
And like very serene and calm.
He fucking jokes about the dwarf guy's accent. Remember? I fucking forgot about that. That's fucked up. But then when he fucking strangles his mother, right? Well, I guess you don't see his mother, but you kind of see her afterwards dead, and then you kind of see her right before. But I guess the thematic that I was going to go with is that, like, when you hear about the traumas that Fleck's character experienced, you don't see them as like this thing that you have the capacity as a spectator to subjectively analyze, right? Like when you see him murder Al, you can be like, well, Al fucking had it coming, you know, like I'm seeing this through the whole narrative, right? And like he was kind of a piece of shit, and the only reason he came to visit him upon the context of his mother dying, but really because he wanted to know information about what he had told the police about the gun.
Yeah, because he also fucked over Arthur and caused Arthur to lose his job.
And got him fired by saying that he had like asked to buy a gun. And then, you know, that when he murders Murray, there's like obviously this whole lead up to like how Arthur feels about, you know, his portrayal of him as a joke, you know, or a joker or whatever, trying to like do stand-up comedy, but, you know, failing miserably. And like, so you have that like capacity to subjectively analyze it, right? But when you hear about the brutalities that he was subject to throughout his life, the mental abuse from his mother, you know, and like the sort of gaslighting or whatever about Thomas Wayne, the abuse that he experienced at the hands of like one of his mom's boyfriends or something, like all you see it in text as like him reading a file, like this happened. And then you see like an interview with his mom where you just see the bruises on her face, but you don't, they don't ever show you the brutality of that violence. And like, it's written into the movie as something that is like concrete and something that really happened, even though there's like an ambiguity there as to like whether, you know, some of that might be delusional. Like who knows? This is all like said by people who have like extreme, you know, mental illness, you know, to the point where they were put into asylums in this narrative. But like, I don't think that takes away from the fact that like, and in the scenes when he's being beaten, like in the very first scene when the kids take the sign from him, you see him take the sign to the face, but like as soon as he hits the ground and the kids start kicking him, the camera zooms in and it's just showing like Arthur Fleck's face, and like, you know, he's being kicked by the kids, and it kind of cuts out in and out of like showing them doing it, but like really the focus is like you're just looking at his face and you're just looking at like his like sort of defeated posture on the ground. Same thing on the bus. You don't even see him pull the gun out. You just see the dude get shot in the head, you know.
Oh yeah,
but, like,
that's right. Because the like lights, like it goes dark, and then the next thing you know, he's like he shot the guy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like the way that the sort of foundational trauma, I guess you could call it, that like leads Joker down this path of madness, like is portrayed as distinctly different from the kind of violence and brutality that he commits and that you're able to interpret based off of his actions. And so in some sense, once again, I think this almost goes to maybe Don's point. I don't even know if this is really your point, but like that like
it's your point now.
That there might be some glorification of him as a character in allowing his actions to be something that you're able to like subjectivize, right? Or like kind of contextualize within the narrative of like him having things done to him which lead to him being a certain way, as opposed to the things being done to him, you know, like just being concrete and just being something that he experienced without the ability to, you know, maybe through therapy or through some other perspective, be able to work through those issues and see them as not something that lead him to violence, but something that are just events in his past that he can overcome and move forward from.
Yeah. And I think an interesting thing about the way that his own, I mean, if you were to say there's like a generative kind of moment, well, this is actually maybe something to talk about, because if you're trying to understand your enemy is just someone whose story you haven't yet heard.
Yeah, fucking god damn it. I mean, we watched the movie with another party that shall not be named, but like, you know, when they came out of the movie, that was their basic interpretation, was like, I really like this because it really just shows the way that like an enemy is just somebody whose story you haven't heard, you know?
It's like,
just
wrong.
Like, what the fuck? No.
Well, here's actually what I think is really important about how the Joker portrays this, or how the film portrays this, is that it tells you the Joker's story. And like, you understand that at least it doesn't show up in a material way, but there's this idea that, okay, he experienced this brutal, horrible violence as a child. And then in some way you're led to think, okay, well, that's my explanatory mechanism for why he eventually becomes who he is. But the thing is like, even if the film like doesn't depict it materially in the film, there's no flashback, there's no cut scene where you see him being brutalized and hurt as a child, there's still a way that I think you could read the film that way. But the important thing is to say, he still has moments of choice. He's still in some way, like, it does not actually glorify and say, well, because he had this happen to him, it now validates like his own responses to it. It's like, no, there's something that does make him monstrous, and you can't explain that away. And to me, also the interesting thing about, or like the idea that he had these things done to him as a child, is that kind of violence, domestic violence, physical abuse, these are things that are still very hidden and very taboo to acknowledge socially. So there's a way that those things in itself are the sorts of hidden violence that never show up in a material, concrete way. They're just these like effects that you see later on in your life or later on in other people's lives. And it's still to this day, it's like that kind of violence is never depicted in this sort of like very spectacleized way. Right. You know? And
I would say that's like where dialectic hands, that's where the dialectic is, right? Because like it's not the issue of whether or not it's appropriate to respond to your life traumas with violence and to like elevate yourself to some kind of like spectacle for society, like take as an example of what's possible. It's specifically the other interpretation of like whether you accept the thing that is presented to you as like the letter of your past, right? Like the documents that you got from Arkham Asylum that say that you are supposed to be broken. It's whether you accept that past as like the actual past that you are like acting in response to. Yeah. And so it's like there's an interpretive dimension more specifically in the past than in like your future choices and like how they will be interpreted. Like you can't stand on your own shoulders and see the future, right? Like you can only respond to like your own, the place from which you came.
I was actually just thinking, you and I actually talked about this, Comrade Alex, on the Bad You episodes, about how the idea that you can essentially find a sort of coherent one-to-one deterministic line between traumas that happened in your past and like how you sort of experience and live your life now. Traumas don't function that way. They function as these sort of retroactive garbage piles where you can just you just like kind of throw all this stuff and you can sort
anything
of
that doesn't make sense in your head just gets thrown into that same category of like, oh, the shit that I don't think about, you know, the thing that just like that happened that I can't really provide an explanation for.
But it's always about the interpretive dimension of like how do you make sense of those events that did happen, and then how in some ways it's precisely through recognizing the past historical traumas in your life that is precisely the thing that no longer allows you to just explain away your entire life and all your choices based on that. It's like now it's like kind of fucked because you know that this is something that's happened to you and you no longer can just explain away whatever it is about your life and your own experience like through those events themselves. It's like now all of a sudden you have this like weird self-conscious moment of sort of the kind of terror of choice, and like now you also like are responsible for decisions that you make, you know?
Freedom is a nightmare sometimes.
It is,
I was gonna say, if you guys want to maybe like try and pick apart some of that article, I think that could be fun. Thought it was like an interesting jumping off point for like a lot of the sort of hot take / reactionary responses to this fucking movie. Like it was very critical of the fact that like the protagonist was a protagonist was a white person, and that I don't know, they were upset because they just sort of, it's almost like the interpretation I had of that article was that they would have been perfectly happy if the Joker character was like a black woman, and like then it wouldn't have been problematic at all, but because it was a white man who committed all of the violent acts, and they just like, I don't know, didn't like white men, the fact that they peripherally thought it might encourage violence of like mass shooters or something, that like the entire movie was like completely bereft of any like valid fucking existence or status as a good movie. Like I don't know, it just seemed very reactionary. I don't have it pulled up, so.
Well, the article we are referencing, it's called Gender, Race, and Ableism in Joker by Zuleika Zevallos. And she, I think, is an Australian sociologist. She sort of writes this from the context of Australia. So I'll post a link in case folks want to read it. So again, I've seen this article posted as sort of a thing of like, listen, guys, like, Joker isn't the hero that we need or isn't the anti-hero that we read. And it's like, again, it's sort of all built on the idea that you're watching Joker thinking that he's this like anti-hero that you're supposed to identify with and have this like positive interpretation of at the end of the film. I don't know. I mean, there's one line, we were talking about the scene where Arthur Fleck confronts Thomas Wayne in the bathroom at the Chaplin showing. So let me find it, because there was a particular interpretation of that I thought epitomized the article. So this is a section of the article which talks about the portrayals of masculinity in the film. This will sort of, I think, encapsulate it. The Joker's rise as anti-hero is celebrated as revolutionary in the film. It isn't. Lower class white men view equity movements as encroaching on their social status. Joker simply re-legitimizes white male anger as a political tool, which it always has been. Arthur kills white affluent dude bros, an obnoxious white male talk show host, which is Murray, played by De Niro, and a mean white male colleague. This inspires a revolution in Gotham where men and clown masks riot. The film pitches this as social commentary, when in fact it's just white male aggrieved entitlement. It actually reminds me of one of our good old logical fallacies, the bare assertion fallacy, which is that to just say that the Joker's rise as an anti-hero is celebrated as revolutionary in the film, it's like, no, it's not. Like, that's just no, that's like not actually what the film is showing. But the other thing too is whenever it does talk about the scene where Fleck confronts Thomas Wayne and basically is like, you're my father, like, I think you're my father, and like, notice me, senpai, notice me, dad.
Calls him dad.
Yeah, and then
Come on, it's me, dad.
He punches him in the face. The way that it sort of describes this is almost like, well, we're supposed to believe that this is about class relations, but it's not. It's about toxic masculinity. And to me, it's just like, no, it's like, it's about class relations. It's like, that's actually like what's happening in the film. It's in some way, it's like, if you think of symbolically the Joker is Thomas Wayne's son, that it really is sort of Thomas Wayne being confronted by the own products of the system that he benefits from, and he responds with violence to that and denies it.
Yeah, I want to say even there's when the news channel, I don't remember exactly when the scene happens in the movie, but she's saying that it's all specifically white men that are at the protests. But then there's a scene in the movie where they like the news anchors like get one of the people who is at the protest like saying what he thinks, and it's very obviously a black man who is like basically saying like, fuck the rich, like, the Waynes, like, they're not going to help our city, and like, we're fucking tired of it, and like, whatever, like, fuck this shit, we're gonna kill the rich, and like, let's do this. The and scene on very obviously a black man.
Yeah, and like, also the scene on the subway car whenever the two cops are following him,
like men, women,
like various races, like, I mean, it was everything. So again, it's almost as if this is sort of very, I guess, like symptomatic of a hot take where it isn't even engaging with actually what happens in the film. It sort of is like already reading it through a particular lens, in standard ideological sort of functioning. Like you don't see material, concrete things right in front of your face because of like the particular lens that you're already reading the film through. So again, I mean, I would be more than happy to agree with some of these criticisms if I thought they actually reflected the film in any sort of meaningful way. But to me, it's just like, this is just blatantly not even talking about things that are just blatantly obvious in the film.
Yeah, she talks about the Zazie Beetz' character as like being a character that's included to humanize the Joker, but then like kind of neglects. I mean, maybe she mentions it a little bit like towards the end of her whole argument of like, oh well, yeah, I guess she was just kind of this was all hallucination, but like really she's only there to like humanize him and like his anger and all this stuff, and it's like, yeah, in the sense that you're supposed to be able to empathize with his like descent into madness. Like I know as much as we joke about like that moment of like Joker rise up off the fucking, hood of the cop car, like that rise is specifically his descent into full Joker madness and like the evil and brutality of like that character and what he's capable of.
Yeah.
Like
complete losing of all humanity.
Yeah. Like there's absolutely no aspect of that that's if it's glorified in the sense that it's like shown in a grandiose way, but it's not glorified in the sense that like the movie is implying that we should all just fucking kill our family and our fucking friends and like the hosts of like popular TV shows, although I wouldn't mind getting rid of Jimmy Fallon. But like, you know, allegedly. But like, no, I'm just saying, you know, like that's completely ridiculous to like the only interpretation of this movie is that like it's absolutely celebrating this kind of violence and encouraging white men to be this way. No, I just like don't believe that that's true. And like it had a very multiracial cast. Like I don't think that you could say it was a whitewashed movie.
I mean, let's be honest. Like
for an ableist movie, they casted like a dwarf, like actual dwarf person. Like yeah. I'm like I don't think that that's it. May be ableist in the portrayal of the character and like the fact that they make fun of that guy and stuff. But like I don't know that the movie itself is trying to argue that anyway.
And one of the things too it sort of critiques is that it casts Joaquin Phoenix as Joker, a man who has like a mental illness. But like part of the ambiguity of the whole film is you don't actually know if like his laughing fits are an actual mental illness or not, or if it's just a story his mom told him. So again, to me, it's like it sort of blatantly obscures or just complete glosses over like these sort of the complicated aspects of the film and just takes them again through this lens that fits very well into the sort of like hot take industry that produces articles like this.
Yeah, I just wanted to read this sentence that you were kind of talking about, Alex. The audience is invited to feel sympathy for the socially awkward white man and ignores that he terrorized a black woman. I just read that and I was like, I thought one of the most intense scenes and that we had talked about earlier was specifically when he shows up in her apartment and it's just like is clearly like terrified and is just like, what are you like? Why are you here? What are you doing here?
Yeah, she's like, I really need you to fucking leave. And it's like becomes very obvious very quickly that like all of what you as a spectator were expected to understand as them sharing time together was like a complete like fantasy, hallucination, you know? And like that's one of the most powerful moments of the movie because it shows that like he was completely, you know, detached from reality for a lot of the time of what was going on, you know?
I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I saw that, I wasn't just like, oh, poor him. I was just like, oh, fuck, can you imagine, like, if you're this woman, like, can you imagine that happening and stuff like that? And,
well, and it like recalls that scene where she comes to his door and she's like, hey, were you following me?
Yeah.
Remember? And then he, in his imagination, makes it out to be like she was kind of like, that's all right. And
no,
like,
but that whole scene is like, that whole scene was fantasy.
Yeah,
like, it's sort of like, well, they call it following, but really it was stalking. It's like the whole point is that it was stalking.
It's like everybody in the audience was like, yeah, no, this is stalking. This is creepy.
Yeah. Let me also say, though, this glosses over something that I think would problematize this reading of like race and gender in this film. And to me, it is hands down one of my favorite scenes in the film, and I think it actually is like one of those potential moments of, if there is a sort of radical potential in this film, it's where it really shows up for me. And I'm very biased about this scene because I'm a social worker, and it's basically the last interaction that Fleck has with his social worker, who's basically working for, you know, some unnamed like social services industry by the city. So he shows up and he's sitting there and he's talking about feeling seen and heard for the first time after he commits the murders. And she basically says, Arthur, you know, I have some bad news for you. And bear in mind, Arthur, white man who, at least in the film, you at this point think that he has some sort of mental illness, living in poverty. And then the social worker, low wage, like employed by the city social worker who's a black woman. So there's this moment where she says, Arthur, I have some bad news for you. Basically, the city has cut all of our social services. And this is the last time we're going to see each other. And he basically says, where am I supposed to get my psych meds? And she's just sort of like, I don't know. But the moment that like I almost wanted to rise up in the theater whenever this happened because she looks at him and she says, they don't give a shit about you. And then she pauses and she says, they don't give a shit about me either. And so whenever I saw that, I'm like,
I remember you literally like you were like clenching your fists. You're like, yeah, fuck yeah.
Because
I was like, yeah.
How powerful of a scene is that? Mm-hmm. The fact that like Arthur, who is getting services from these systems, who's this like fucking forgotten person in this like set of social relations, and the low wage social worker, there's an identification there that is really, really powerful. And again, part of the tragedy of the film to me is that nothing ever comes of that. But that is a genuine moment of solidarity. Mm-hmm. And it's actually something that I feel very strongly about as a social worker who has been in in that position. And like, you understand that there are very complicated relationships and like identifications between you who's supposed to be providing these things and the people who like need them most. And then anyway, like, but to me that was a really powerful scene. So whenever I read this article and its discussions of like race and gender, like my response was almost like, don't you dare divide the working class, god damn it. Yeah. Because that was like in some way like one of those moments of the film that like complicates this whole like reading of gender and race and disability in this article, because it's like, no, there were moments of solidarity in that film across those divisions, but those don't register in this sort of analysis because it's already not seeing anything about class relations. It just inherently denies that there's anything related to class in this film.
Right. First of all, like, Arthur Fleck is not a character who's acknowledging any of these class divisions. Like, he absolutely 100% has stated explicitly in the movie and, you know, validates this perspective throughout his character's development that he does not believe in anything and he does not care that those things are happening, the social movements and all that stuff. He never wants any part of it. And then she's talking about gender and race relations in this article, and then she has like a small section about class, which she uses as an opportunity to mention how Australia is basically the society that Joker is living in the movie, that like they're cutting funding to welfare or like to recipients of like mental health care and things like that. And I'm like, that's everywhere, right? Like that's the whole point of why the scene was included and why it makes the movie relevant. In a sense, is because it's supposed to contextualize this individual's life within something that you can relate to as a, you know, whatever first world moviegoer, and like that's absolutely understood by the movie itself. Like it's you know, self-aware of like how it's presenting the society that this loner, whatever crazy deranged person like comes up in, and like it seems like a very opportunistic way of presenting the movie, as though it like wasn't aware of the fact that these situations really occur in the real world and people are really suffering from these kinds of things. Like,
I mean, as you mentioned, I just reread that section in this article, and I'm like completely unclear of what her point of. The point seems to be basically like Australia is doing all of this as well. Like, seems to be upset that this movie wasn't set in
Australia.
Yeah.
Or something?
Well, like literally that section ends and just says, "Who needs 1970s Gotham when this is modern day Australia?" That like seems to be the entire point of that. I don't know. Like all the other ones, even though I don't really buy into the criticisms of most of the other sections, at least we're like talking about the movie
about
and why it didn't.
Section was supposed to be about.
And it's like, I don't know. I didn't get that at all.
Also, I'm not trying to like take away from this argument that Joker is a character who suffers from like uncontrollable laughter, because, you know, that is a real condition that that people really have. I think Joaquin Phoenix was even given footage of like people who suffer from that condition so he could like develop his character better. And like, I think to say that the movie is ableist for portraying its main character as suffering from a neurological condition is like, I just don't understand what her argument is. It's like, and then she's saying that like his mother is like disabled to the point where she needs a caretaker. And I'm like, I don't know that she's disabled. I think that she's fine. I think in fact, it makes it really weird that he was like bathing her, because I was like, that's you giving your mother a bath when she seems perfectly capable of walking around the house and like feeding her. Well, I guess he feeds her too, but like, I don't know. She doesn't seem bedridden. Maybe she's
not. No, she's not.
Like,
this is what we were talking about.
She gets up and walks around and stuff, and so it gave me the impression that there was something very wrong and odd about their relationship, because there were some moments where I was like, oh, she's infirmed and he's caring for her because she has no ability to care for herself, and then there were other moments where I was like, oh, she's like fine to walk around and like she's writing letters and like trying to deliver letters to Thomas Wayne and like has these like, you know, elaborate sort of fantasies about what's, you know, what her relationship was to the family, and like, I don't know. It's just,
I mean, the film,
how is that ableist?
I mean, I guess what's interesting is the film sort of obscures the fact that the relationship that Arthur had and his mother, again, was actually like a deeply emotionally abusive relationship towards him. It just completely excludes that whole aspect of the relationship.
She also wants to say that the audience like cheers when he murders his mom. Mm-hmm. Which I don't know about you guys, but
that was a pretty brutal fucking scene. And afterwards, I was like shook because I was like not expecting it at all.
Yeah.
Like I kind of thought he might murder the TV show host. I thought he might, you know, lash out in anger at Al, but I was not expecting him to like go to the hospital and murder his mother. Like that was the one murder in the whole movie that I like basically was caught off guard by, because I was like, oh fuck, he's just gonna kill her. Like, holy shit. Like maybe like a minute before he did it, I was like, oh shit, he's gonna kill her. But like, I don't know. It just didn't seem like the next thing that somebody would do after like finding out that she had lied or that she was crazy or something. Like that was fully deranged and detached. Like he himself suffers from mental illness. He himself suffers from delusion. So like what was his justification for like killing his mother, who obviously, according to all the records that he found, was suffering from the same delusions and the same kind of mental illness, other than out of like personal anger and just like destructive fucking self-pity and like the satisfaction that it would give him to like commit murder of his own mother. Like it's fucked up. Like there's no way you could interpret that as like a celebration of white hedonism, right? Like that's what she makes the argument is like ableism. I think she says something, ableism is not a prop for the celebration of white hedonism. I do not think that those scenes in any way were a celebration of white hedonism. I don't think that you could even interpret his bombastic outbursts of brutality as like hedonistic. Right? Maybe if you like are like fully in the world of, you are experiencing what Joker experiences as like happiness, but it doesn't even seem to me like he's experiencing it as happiness. It's obviously very tragic for him and like fully within a world of like depressed, cynical, and like resigned perspective on all of the world, like almost nihilism, right? So like where's the hedonism in that? Like, I don't know.
Let me touch on the article's commentary about the larger like social protest and like outburst of riots and violence that are going on in the background. That Joker, in a completely self-serving, almost like unintentional way, becomes the figurehead of, but like gives zero shits about it outside of the capacity that mass violence has to just glorify his own narcissistic like self-image and just complete throwing himself into this like fantasy of Joker. So this is near the end of the article. She says, when Joker begins, we see protesters holding resist signs, an allusion to anti-Trump protests in 2017. However, the film ends with the Joker sycophants holding resist signs upside down. White patriarchy's co-opting of social protest, centering white violence, wins in the end. I wanted to just touch on, I found that just to be such a
I thought it was
leap.
a callback to the fact that he was holding the sign upside down at the beginning before the kids jump him. Like, remember, he's like, he has this moment where he's like dancing and then he has the sign upside down that says like, come on in, we're in business or something. He like does a move where he like realizes the sign's upside down and he goes like, whoops, and then he turns it right side up. Like, that's like right before he gets the sign stolen from him. So I thought it was supposed to be a callback to like the beginning of the movie where he was just like a lowly clown spinning signs to like the like aftermath of all of the shit that happened, where like there's like this whole movement that's like now holding signs, and like it's like framed as a comedy. I know it's not a fucking comedy, but it's framed as a comedy, so it's supposed to like show the flawed nature of like the development or like sort of comedy of errors that led to like this fucking symbolic mistake, right? He's holding the resist sign upside down, which is like just like a echo of like the mistakes that led to fucking Joker developing into the figurehead of this movement. Like,
I mean, my other thought about that too, I mean, you could alternatively read that again. It's not glorifying the Joker as this sort of co-optation of whatever resist meant. And also like, I mean, that's kind of a little bit of a bad historical read too, because the whole aspect of the resist thing very quickly became persist. And that also was co-opted by like, mostly like this sort of like white liberal sort of perspective on it. But I guess what strikes me as really important, or like how this sort of functions, is the whole point is to like caution the viewer against some sort of mass uprising against these sort of like social relations and like poverty and inequality and all these things, and to actually caution you against potentially placing at the head of that some figure who really is only doing it to glorify their own like narcissistic urges and like their own glorification. Like in some ways, like she's critiquing it for the exact point that it's making, which is almost agreeing with the article, which is like the whole point is to like caution you against who you place at the head, the symbolic head of these movements. And I mean, also to be clear, you can find examples of this sort of like, dare I say, opportunism in any movement, especially in movements around racial justice and gendered, feminist critiques and like gender equality. Like this isn't something that's unique to like white male figures at the head of these movements, although it's also applicable. But to say that that's essentially the only way to read that, again, is just completely, it's like, were you even watching the same movie?
Yeah, if there had been a figure at the head of this movement, like the Joker character was portrayed as somebody who was like a quote unquote woke person, and they were like championing the values of like the genders and the races that are like seen as minorities in our culture and like whatever, if they were like championing those values, would you be okay with the like brutality and us like empathizing and glorifying that character if that were the case? Like, I just don't, like, what's the converse of this argument? Who wouldn't you, as like a woke analyst of this movie, like criticize who was put into that position of like being the figurehead of this movement. Like, who wouldn't receive your criticism? Like, I don't think that there's a perfect embodiment of like someone that was like perfectly devoid of like all problematic understandings of interpretation. Like, I just like, in my head, I'm just like, well, what is the substance of your critique other than just like, I don't like that it's a white guy. And like, we should really be paying attention to the issues of like a different gender or a different race or I guess a different class, but not really even materially.
I mean, her criticism of it being ableist seems like almost the exact opposite of her other criticisms, which is because she has a line in there or something about how like it would have been okay if it was just like an angry white man that didn't have like some disability or something like that.
Oh yeah,
like it would have been okay. Yeah, like you can't use his disability as a reason to justify his violence or something.
Yeah, like that. And it's like, well, if he was like a different race or a different gender, like wouldn't the argument have been this? Like, I don't understand how you can say like it's a problem that he's white and male. But if you make him disabled, though, that's a problem. Like, it seems like these are opposite arguments coming at.
Yeah, like at its heart, this is a movie about a white male. It's just glorifying white males, and like can't make him have a disability and try and distract me from your ableism. You know, it's like, but that's what like that's just you fully ignoring like a whole aspect of this character. Not to mention the whole symbolic dimension of the laughter and like how it figures.
Yeah, there's
into,
no
like,
symbolic dimension there.
Nothing symbolic about this movie. It's just fully literal. This is a guy's life that we're like following him around and seeing as like a plain as day, fully cognizant portrayal of like what we should aspire to as society or something. And I'm just like, that is so naive a reading that like I don't even really understand where you're coming from. Like, were you just really angry at like a friend who liked the movie, or like where the fuck did this come from? Like,
I actually
what
have
are you
to
talking about?
I have to tell you my take on this. It's a guess. I mean, it's just like a sort of symptomatic reading of this article is going back to kind of maybe where we started. The whole first part of the movie very effectively shows you a very empathetic character. And I wonder if there's part of the reaction here, which is this sort of like, again, going back to this sort of function of like these intrapsychic forces of projection and this sort of like defense. I wonder if the fact that the film very, I think, effectively does make you empathize and sort of see the alienation and exclusion from this figure who's precisely someone who's not supposed to be alienated and excluded in this particular discourse, which is some, middle-aged white guy who has all these experiences in his background. I mean, part of me was that I wonder if there's this like projection of maybe the fact that it did create a sort of sense of like empathy and identification. But the idea of that is like deeply, deeply challenging, especially if we're typically used to like the sole narrative around this is that like white men embody these systems and like this is the only way that they can behave. And so part of it was this like very almost kind of like violent reaction of like I have to like project this sort of identification out of myself into the character and then like ruthlessly critique it precisely because it effectively made me feel some sort of identification with this character that I normally like would not feel that I have anything in common with.
Yeah, how
Again,
dare you
don't
make
fucking
me...
divide the working class. I won't stand for it.
Yeah, like how dare you make me empathize with a white person who's suffering? I will not, like.
And I think that's why there's no mention of the conversation between Fleck and the black social worker about like they don't give a shit about either of us. I think that's precisely why it doesn't show up in this article. We've talked about Joker quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to say, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I think it's a really complicated film. There's a lot going on. There's so much happening in every frame.
It's not quite Transformers level, but it's close.
That's true. It's not quite. But I mean, whatever would be. God, imagine if Michael Bay would have fucking directed Joker.
Jesus. Well, then it just would have been another fucking run-of-the-mill, like fucking explosion-ridden trash heap. So it probably still would have been worth talking about for 2 hours. But,
Perhaps.
Very different conversation.
It would have been a very different conversation.
Yeah.
Well, do y'all have final thoughts? Anything that we haven't touched on?
No, not for me.
Yeah, no, man. I think that's pretty much it. Like, give it a chance, maybe. Try and go watch it, see if you like it. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people that are just boycotting this movie on principle.
Yeah, I think
for fucking who knows what reason. If there's maybe I'm biased too. I fucking love a villain movie, man. Who doesn't love a villain movie?
Apparently most people who did not go see this movie.
Right. And in the context of all the things that have happened, shootings and like all of the like focus on societal violence that society has had lately, like I understand why this would fucking trigger you in that sense of like you don't want to go see a movie that's about a white man's descent into like brutal violence.
Sure.
But like it's a good movie. It's a good commentary on society, and it's supposed to be about the development of a villain. Like you have to keep that in mind when you watch a movie like this. This is like the villain that poses Batman as a figure, and like I'm with Joker, like fuck Batman, but like like at the end of the day, like I don't think that's a fantasy. That's like a comic book reality. Like I'm not saying that there's not truth in the fiction, right? Like I'm a fucking Lacanian, but like at the same time, you can't just dismiss the whole movie just based on the fact that it's like the development of a violent character. What was American History X? What was fucking The Departed? What was like every Scorsese movie that's ever fucking come out, right? That's like what it's about, the rise and fall of a fucking man. I don't know, like what are you so angry or scared to see in the Joker, right? That you don't see 100 times over in every other fucking movie that comes out. It's the exact same narrative over and over again. If you're this mad about Joker, where were you at like the other fucking 10 movies that came out in the last couple of years that had a fucking white protagonist that were about like, you know, his descent into violence as a result of some trauma in his life? Like, come on, man. It's like a huge thematic in movies. Like, get over it. It was a well-made film, and like it doesn't encourage or glorify incel violence. That's a misreading, like an egregious misreading.
So like all of this identification of incel violence or something like that always goes back to the Dark Knight Joker, right?
Yeah.
This is when this started. And so to me the question is, if this Joker film came out first, would there still be this identification of this Joker with that part of the political spectrum? And to me, I would say I don't think so, because
I don't think so either.
No,
like
man.
the Heath Ledger Joker, I think, is like an interesting, almost just like a sort of a force of chaos and violence or something like that. But I think when you watch this, there's not really a way in which you like. I don't think you ever want to be this version of the Joker. Like when you watch it, like it doesn't seem like a character that anybody would want to find themselves emulating or something like that. Whereas I feel like for the Heath Ledger one, like, yeah, if you...
he seemed like a badass character.
Yeah,
he
exactly.
was challenging
Just,
Batman, and he was so fucking deranged, and like,
he was just like powerful.
Yeah,
and
he had like armies of goons and shit working for him and stuff. I think if you want to talk about, you were talking about floating signifiers, Adam. Like the Joker in the Batman movies absolutely was the embodiment of a floating signifier. I mean, he himself told about like 3 or 4 different origin stories for himself in the context of that movie.
How he got those scars.
Yeah, I got these scars, and like it's just kind of this fucking just has like the. You want to know how I got these scars? And it's just like that character of the Joker, without the contextualization of where his actual origin came from, in a lot of ways is, I think, the force behind everybody's like apprehension at watching this movie. But I think that there's not really a way you could sit through this whole movie and then at the end of the day be like, yeah, I want to be that guy. Unless you're a fucking criminally insane person who's already like fucked up enough to like interpret that kind of a life and that kind of a justification for brutality as like being a justification in the first place. You already would have had to like be inclined to want to hurt someone as a result of your past traumas to interpret this movie in that way. And I don't think that the vast majority of people that would watch it would see that. It'd be really difficult to stretch it into like being like something that's supposed to encourage me to commit violent acts, you know, like that just doesn't, it's just not there. I don't know. It's like really difficult. I don't care how you fucking slice it. I don't think, unless you were actually deranged. Right. And maybe people are to a certain degree.
But here's the thing, though. Like, if that is the case, a film is not going to be the sort of flashpoint that's going to create that condition. Right. Like, I think that is a firmly like idealist, almost like you buy so thoroughly into the assumptions of like being a culture war participant that you think that culture dictates what happens and what doesn't. And I think that, again, to me, it's sort of a way that you kind of displace all the anxieties we have about these large social forces that we don't really understand, we don't feel that we can control, but you can control it if you feel that you can sort of project that into the way that a film works and what it means. And so whether I decide to go see it or not, as if it conforms to the simplistic narrative I have in my head about, or like the anxiety that I have about these larger social forces and what they mean.
Yeah, I think we have a mutual friend that's criticized movies because they haven't been like revolutionary enough or something like that, or they don't start a revolution, you know, and just like a movie is never going to do this. Like, why is this a criticism? When I'd ask them, like, oh, well, what film is? And he was like, no movie has ever been made.
Nothing that's ever been made.
It's like, well, maybe this isn't like a great criticism of what a film should be then. You know, but yeah, and it's like, a film is fundamentally just like not going to be able to do that. Like it's not going to be able to, like you were saying, Adam, just like it's not going to create condition, like it's going to reflect conditions that already exist, but it's not going to help create conditions that produce these things.
I mean, I think maybe the last thing I would say just on that point too is that to me, what this Joker signifies, or like what it is as a floating signifier, if it's reflecting anything, I mean, a floating signifier is this thing that we get to sort of dump our like unconscious content into. It's a side of struggle, right? About what it actually means. And to me, if I ask myself, well, what does this Joker mean as a floating signifier for right now? If anything, it signals like our anxiety about having to actually face these large social conditions that create monsters, that create violence, and we have no idea how to stop it. And I think we will never have any idea how to stop it as long as all we do is like read everything in this sort of like paranoid reading kind of way, the way that like Eve Sedgwick would talk about it. All we do is look at this and like say this thing, whether I've even seen it or not, must embody this sort of particular set of social relations about gender and race and like masculinity and all this other stuff. So we have to like destroy that and tear it down. Despite the fact that the film itself, if you read it in a sort of reparative kind of reading, exactly is at least trying to show you the limitations of any sort of individual response to these conditions, and also blocks you from being able to see the real moments of solidarity. And to me, that's what it signifies more than anything else, is just our deeply anxious sense of not knowing what to do about these social forces that create monsters every single day. And that's what fucking capitalism excels at.
Yeah. I would absolutely say, it's like that whole thing about like the trauma being both the retroactive cause of like your bad behavior, or like bad decisions in your life, but also in a reparative sense, like you're saying, Adam, being the ground from which you can move forward from bad decisions, from making your life about like redemption and like angry violence. Like if anything, our culture right now is so scared of their own traumas or of future possible traumas that we're preemptively trying to ban movies before they become those traumatic receptacles of like, this is the cause behind why someone went and committed a senseless act. Like, right, it's really easy in hindsight to be like, oh, well, this person was obviously inspired by the Joker movie. But it's like, but that doesn't address the underlying conditions that made them interpret a movie like the Joker.
That's right, because there's some material set of relations that like cause that interpretation to be as powerful as it was. And
it's
so
opportunistic to the nth degree. Like it's opportunistic. And so,
I mean, maybe like on that note, I mean, the last thing I would say is just that, to the degree that we can't have a working through of these exact sorts of problems, is to the degree that we're just going to deny and repress continually whatever it is that's actually causing these horrible effects and violence and this type of like the creation of these monsters. And so that's the only thing, right? It's like, I mean, that's why we have to keep going back and reading our Freud, because it has to be a working through. It cannot be a repression or a denial. Because if there's one thing we know about trauma, it's that to the degree that you do that, it will haunt you every moment of your life.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Sure.
All right. Thanks, Don. Next time I come aside down. You're the big other. You're just like, I approve.
You're like the Matt Welty of the group.
All right, y'all. This has been an incredibly long episode. Well, thanks, listeners. And we know it's a long one. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you got something out of it. Again, we hope you got an icy cold take and not our hot takes.
Yeah, ice cold motherfuckers for life.
That's what we do. All right.
Hashtag society the movie.
Hashtag we live in a hashtag society movie. All right, y'all. We'll catch y'all next time. Peace.
See ya.